I only needed shelter, but that broken mold seemed to know my name.
She was 24 and homeless. No lease, no family, no coat warm enough for river wind, just a canvas tool roll with 2 burned handles and $10 she had kept folded behind the photograph of her father. And with that $10, she bought a half-collapsed bronze bell foundry on the east edge of Troy in Rensselaer County, New York, a place the fire insurance maps stopped naming in 1957. Half the roof had caved into the casting room. Black sand lay across the floor like cooled weather. The county had condemned it since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the throat of a rejected giant bell mold, in a sealed clay compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Cleo Maren Voss had been listening her whole life without knowing it. Not listening the way teachers meant when they tapped chalk against a board, or the way impatient adults meant when they leaned down and repeated instructions with their mouths tightened. Cleo listened the way some children learn weather. She heard a door before it opened. She knew the difference between rain on tin and rain on tar paper. She could tell, from her cot in the narrow room behind the kitchen, whether her father had come home tired, pleased, defeated, or hiding a pain he did not yet have words for, because each condition placed a different weight in his steps. She was born in Cohoes, upriver from Albany, where the Mohawk turns itself toward the Hudson and the brick mills stand with their windows like darkened teeth. Her earliest memories were made of heat and metal, not in a grand shop, but in a backyard shed where her father repaired pumps, pulleys, cracked stove plates, and whatever iron pieces the neighbors brought him wrapped in newspaper. On summer evenings, when the mosquitoes came out of the damp grass and the canal water smelled green, he would set her on an upturned milk crate and let her hold a file too dull to harm anything. Her hands were compact and quick even then. She had her mother's square palms and her father's patience. She learned to turn bolts into saucers, to lay washers in size order, to hold still when sparks travelled across the cement like fireflies with tempers. The other children on the block ran after ice cream trucks and bicycles, but Cleo stayed near the workbench, watching the colour of heated steel move from black to plum to cherry to a brightness that seemed almost white enough to speak. Her mother, Elaine, was a woman who kept curtains washed and jars labelled, who moved through life as though there were a correct drawer for every sorrow. She worked at a dental office 3 days a week, answered phones with a pleasant voice, and wore her hair in a careful twist that came loose only at bedtime. Elaine loved cleanliness with the devotion of a person who has known disorder and never forgiven it. She did not like the shed. She did not like soot carried indoors on cuffs. She did not like the smell of quench water, coal smoke, axle grease, or her husband's wool shirt after a day close to flame. But Cleo's father, Matthias Voss, could not separate work from tenderness. He spoke to broken things as if they had simply lost the courage to remain useful. He never called a cracked hinge junk until he had tried it under light, turned it twice in his fingers, and considered what pressure had made it fail. His voice was low, a little rough at the edges, and slow enough that Cleo learned not to rush her answers. When she burned her finger for the first time on a rod he had warned her not to touch, he did not scold her. He held her hand under cold water and told her to watch the redness carefully. "Heat tells the truth before pain does," he said. She was 6 years old. She remembered the sentence because it did not sound like a rule. It sounded like a door left open. The true keeper of the family craft was not her father, though he honoured it with his whole back and every nick in his knuckles. It was her great-uncle Silas Maren, her grandmother's younger brother, who had spent nearly 50 years in and around foundries in Troy, Watervliet, and Menands before his lungs grew too tender for the furnace rooms. Silas lived alone in a narrow clapboard house off River Street, close enough to the Hudson that fog sometimes settled in his kitchen before breakfast. He had one clouded eye, a beard yellowed by pipe smoke, and fingers bent at the joints from decades of gripping tongs, files, calipers, and the handles of wooden flasks. Every Saturday morning Matthias drove Cleo to Silas's house in a dented blue truck. They arrived at 8, never 7:55 and never 5 after, because Silas believed time was the first material a craftsperson should. He would already have coffee made for Matthias and a cup of weak tea for Cleo, sweetened with 1 spoon of honey and cooled with a dash of milk. On the kitchen table lay the weekend's lesson, not announced, never praised in advance, always waiting. Some Saturdays it was sand, not beach sand, he would tell her. Never that round lazy grain that slid apart under pressure, but casting sand darkened with clay and temper, gritty enough to hold a print, obedient enough to let go when the pattern lifted. He taught her to ram it into a flask with careful strikes, firm at the corners, lighter at the centre, no anger in the wrist. He showed her how a pattern must withdraw clean, how vents were not afterthoughts but breathing places, how metal would punish any hollow made in vanity. Other Saturdays were for wax, gates, sprues, risers, seam lines, parting dust, and the patient correction of errors. So small a careless person would not have found them until the pour went bad. Silas made her work slowly. If she tried to hurry, he took away the tool and set it back on the table. If she guessed, he made her begin again. He never called her gifted, which may have been his kindest restraint. He called her careful. He called her exact. Once, after she repaired the edge of a sand mould with the flat of a butter knife and her own breath held tight in her chest, he looked at it for a long while and nodded once. "That will not shame the metal," he said. On the shelf over his stove stood 4 handbells, non-polished, all dark with use. He had made 2 of them himself. The others, he said, came from shops already gone before Cleo was born, once a month. He set them on the table and made her listen. Not ring, listen, first with her ears, then with her fingertips resting near the rim as the sound travelled away. 1 bell opened bright and faded quickly. 1 carried a low sorrow under its note. 1 trembled unevenly as though 2 sounds were arguing inside it. The last was plain, steady, and clean. Silas said that bell had been tuned by a man who understood restraint. A bell, he told her, was not simply poured, it was born too heavy, then taught to sing by subtraction. The lathe took metal from the inside wall in careful rings. Removed too little and the note stayed dull. Removed too much and the voice was gone forever. Every true maker had to learn that repair was not always addition. Sometimes mercy was the exact amount taken away. That became the sentence Cleo kept longest. Every honest bell is tuned by what it can bear to lose. Silas said it on a February afternoon while snow slipped down his kitchen window in wet lines and a pot of barley soup clicked softly on the stove. Cleo was 11. She did not understand all of it then, but she understood his face when he said it. He was not speaking only of bells. He was speaking of families, of hands, of breath, of shops that closed, and men who carried their knowledge home in paper bags because nobody had asked them to teach it. When Matthias died, the shed went silent before the house did. It was a Thursday in late October, with the maples still holding a few leaves like rusted coins. He had been repairing a hydraulic press for a salvage yard south of Albany, and his heart gave out while he was bent over a fitting, 1 hand still around the wrench. The men at the yard wrapped his tools in an army blanket and drove them back themselves. Elaine received them at the front door without asking the men to come inside. Cleo stood in the hallway and watched the blankets sag between 2 sets of hands. After the funeral, small disappearances began. First, the blue truck was sold to pay for expenses nobody had explained. Then the anvil went, then the post vise, the drill press, the trays of dies, her father's numbered files, the brass calipers Silas had given him, and the iron ladle hung above the shed door. Objects Cleo had known as permanent were lifted, priced, carried off, and gone. Men she had never met came with pickups and cigarettes, asking no questions because money had already done the talking. She did not cry in front of them. She stood beside the shed wall with her burned hands in her sleeves and tried to memorize the shape of every absence. Silas lasted less than 2 years after Matthias. By then Cleo was nearly 17 and riding the bus to Troy on Saturdays because Elaine had remarried and the new order of the house had no use for old roots. Silas had grown thinner, his cough left a copper taste in the room. Still, he made tea. Still, he placed lessons on the table. On the last Saturday she saw him, he had her hold a tuning fork to the wooden table and asked what she heard after the first sound disappeared. She told him she heard a hum beneath the hum. He smiled without showing teeth. "Then you are not lost yet," he said. He died the following Wednesday at Samaritan Hospital before she could get there. His house was emptied with a speed that had the feel of weather turning. Elaine's brother, Roland Pike, handled the arrangements. He was a large man with a soft voice and hands that stayed clean no matter what he touched. He wore good coats, used cologne too early in the morning, and called himself practical. Cleo watched him carry boxes from Silas's kitchen and load them into his sedan without asking what they held. When she asked about the handbells, Roland said the place had been full of scrap, and that sentiment could not pay storage fees. The bells vanished, so did Silas's notebooks, his calipers, his clay recipes, the photographs of furnace crews standing bare-armed before open doors of light. Cleo searched the trash behind the house and found only broken jars, an address book swollen by rain, and the wrapper from the honey he had used in her tea. Roland moved into the family's life as water finds a low foundation. He was not loud, that would have been easier to name. He was not a man who broke plates or slammed doors. He worked by correction, by raised eyebrows, by the gentle pressure of being the only person in the room who claimed to understand money. He became Elaine's advisor first, then her brother who stopped by, then the man who had keys, opinions, receipts, passwords, and finally the deed box in his own file cabinet. He said he was helping. He said a widow could be taken advantage of. He said Cleo needed direction because a girl who spent her life around furnaces would mistake stubbornness for skill. The house changed under him. Matthias's shed became storage for patio chairs and damp cardboard. The workbench was pushed against the wall. A shelf of welding rods rusted in their tubes. Roland had the electrical service disconnected after telling Elaine it was a hazard. He sold the remaining machinery from Matthias's shop to a dealer in Schenectady and told Cleo the prices were poor because the market for such things had collapsed. Later she saw the dealer's listing in a regional paper and understood that what Roland called poor was only poor for the dead man's daughter. By 19, Cleo had work at a metal finishing plant near Green Island, where she polished brass fittings and learned to keep her breathing shallow around chemicals that left a sweet bite in the throat. At 21, she took shifts at a small fabrication shop that let her sweep, deburr cut pieces, and occasionally help with paws when the men were short-handed. She was good with heat because she respected it. She was good with timing because Silas had trained impatience out of her. The scars came not from ignorance but from a bad crucible lift on a rain-heavy day, when steam flashed upward and ran bright pain across the backs of both her hands. The shop owner paid for the clinic visit, then went out of business by winter. Roland used the scars as evidence. He would glance at her hands during Sunday meals and let silence gather around them. He told Elaine that men were built for furnace work because they knew when to step back. He told Cleo that pride looked different on a woman and cost more. He offered names of offices where she might answer phones. He said no one wanted to hire someone with hands like damaged leather for front counter work, but a person had to learn humility somewhere. Elaine said little. She folded napkins. She moved dishes from table to sink. She let Roland's words settle in the house like dust on a sill. Once, when Cleo looked directly at her, Elaine lowered her eyes to the gravy spoon and wiped its handle with her thumb. The eviction came on March 3, 2021. There had been sleet since morning. It ticked against the kitchen windows and made the porch boards shine dark. Cleo had returned from a closed interview at a machine shop in Watervliet, her boots wet through, her resume softening in the folder under her coat. On the kitchen table sat a cardboard produce box with her name written on the side in Roland's square hand. Inside were 2 shirts, a hairbrush, the photograph of Matthias, 1 pair of socks, and the canvas tool roll Silas had stitched for her from heavy duck cloth. The tool roll stopped her, not because it was valuable to anyone else, but because Roland had handled it. He had tied the leather thong too tight, in the wrong knot, trapping the smell of smoke and beeswax inside like something living. Roland stood beside the stove with one hand resting on the back of Elaine's chair. Elaine sat at the table, fully dressed for work though she was not due at the dental office that day. Her purse was in her lap. Her gloves were folded on top of it. She did not look up. Roland spoke in the steady tone he used for banks. Contractors. And grieving women. This house is not yours anymore. Cleo. 8 words. Careful as a lock. Cleo waited for her mother to move. A hand on the table. A word. Even the lifting of her eyes would have been something a body could live on for another hour. But Elaine looked at the gloves in her lap and pressed their fingers flat, one by one, as though preparing them for a drawer. Roland slid an envelope across the table. It held $10 and a photocopy of a storage notice for belongings. Cleo had not agreed to store. He said there was a shelter in Albany. He said the arrangement would be best for everyone. He said he hoped she would use this as a beginning, not a grievance. The sleet kept touching the glass. The refrigerator clicked on, hummed, clicked off. Cleo lifted the cardboard box. The bottom sagged under its modest weight. At the doorway, she set it down once, untied the tool roll, and corrected the knot. Her hands shook, but only after the leather lay flat. She did not say goodbye. 6 weeks on the road did not look like wandering from the inside. It looked like arithmetic. The first night she slept in the waiting room at the Albany Rensselaer rail station until a security guard told her she had to have a ticket. She bought the cheapest one she could find, not to travel but to stay near warmth for another hour, then lost $2.25 to a cup of coffee because her fingers would not stop trembling. The second night she slept behind a laundromat on Central Avenue, where dryer vents breathed damp heat through a metal grate and the pavement held the day's cold in its bones. After that came places arranged by weather and permission. A church basement in Menands that smelled of floor wax and canned soup. A bench beneath the awning of a closed pharmacy in Watervliet. A pallet behind a grocery store in Green Island where the night manager, a woman with silver hair pinned under a wool cap, pretended not to see her until morning and left a bruised apple on the loading dock. A bus shelter on Hoosick Street where headlights came at her through rain and went away again. 2 nights in a hay barn outside Brunswick after she followed the road too far and asked a farmer if she could sleep under the overhang. He said only until dawn. His wife brought a jar of water without speaking. Cleo kept the $10 bill folded behind her father's photograph and spent coins first. She counted them under library tables, in restroom stalls, beneath the dim light of 24-hour gas stations where clerks watched her without cruelty and without welcome. $9.40, $7.10, $5.82, $4.25 after laundry, $3.11 after a roll, a packet of peanut butter crackers, and a bus fare she should not have taken but did because rain had soaked through her coat lining. She learned which doors opened without questions. The public library in Albany let a person sit if she was clean and did not sleep too obviously. The Troy Public Library, on 2nd Street, had radiators that clicked like a room full of tired beetles and high windows where afternoon light arrived softened by dust. She washed in sinks when no one was looking, dried her cuffs under hand dryers and read repair manuals because the pages gave her mind a place to stand. She read about masonry, roof flashing, stovepipe clearances, black mold, county tax auctions, and the safe handling of asbestos. She read old trade magazines because nobody else took them from the bound shelves. Sometimes she turned pages only to feel paper obey her hands. Her burns had healed into shiny ridges by then, tight in cold weather, pale across the knuckles, darker near the wrists. People noticed, children stared, adults looked away as if courtesy could erase what curiosity had already taken. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-April, when the sky above Troy had the flat pewter colour of river towns before rain, Cleo found the classified ad in a weekly county bulletin left near the library copier. It was printed in the smallest type, under municipal surplus and tax foreclosure disposition. Most of the listings were for lots too narrow to build on, sheds without access, drainage parcels, and one cinder block office with unpaid liens larger than its roof. Near the bottom of the column, a line had been circled in blue pencil by someone who must have changed their mind. Former industrial outbuilding. Bell Works Annex. East Troy. Condemned. NO Utilities. No warranty. B-Wire assumes all risk. Minimum bid, $10. The words did not rise from the page. They waited there. Bell Works Annex. Cleo set one fingertip on the line and felt nothing but paper. Still, something in her body went alert. Not sudden, not grand, only exact. She copied the address in the margin of an expired bus schedule. Then she copied it again on the back of a library receipt, in case Rain took the first one. She asked the reference librarian where county surplus bids were handled. And the librarian, a thin man with half-moon glasses and a cardigan missing one button, wrote the office hours on a sticky note. "That building is not habitable," he said. Gently. Cleo nodded. "I know." He looked at her hands, then at the bulletin, then pretended he had not looked at either one. The decision to travel was made without drama because she had spent all her drama staying alive. She had one bill left, one photograph, one tool roll, one address. In the restroom she washed her face, combed her hair with water, and buttoned her shirt to the throat, though one button had cracked. She took from her box only what she could carry on her back and in her arms. The rest she placed behind the library dumpster in a paper bag, not because it was worthless, but because the body has limits and a road will teach them without pity. By evening she stood outside the library under a narrow stone ledge while rain began to fall straight and cold. Cars passed with their wipers working. Somewhere downhill, beyond the brick fronts and traffic lights, the Hudson moved in its patient channel, carrying thaw water, silt, and the hidden memory of factories that had once sent bells by rail to churches, schools, courthouses, ships and farms scattered across the country. Cleo unfolded the $10 bill from behind her father's photograph and smoothed it against the library wall. The next morning, she would walk to the county office and offer all the money she had for a condemned place nobody wanted. Because sometimes exile does not end with a door opening. Sometimes it begins with a deed. By first light, the rain had left a grey shine on the sidewalks, and Cleo was already walking north with her box held against her ribs. The city had not awakened all at once. It came to itself in separate sounds. A bus sighing at the curb, a bakery door unlocked from the inside, a newspaper bundle dropped hard enough to make pigeons lift from the cornice above. She moved through it without entering any part of it. Her boots took on water at the seams, her sleeves darkened where the cardboard softened against them. The canvas tool roll, tied across the top of the box, bumped lightly against her wrist with each step, a small kept weight. The county office did not open until 9. She knew that from the sticky note folded in her pocket, but a person with nowhere to wait learns to arrive early and stand still. She crossed from 2nd Street toward the municipal buildings, passing brick facades washed to a dull red by rain, iron railings cold under her palm when she paused at intersections, and gutters carrying last night's water in narrow, deliberate streams. A delivery driver looked at her twice. A man in a grey suit stepped around her box as if it had been set in his path by mistake. The wind off the Hudson was damp and carrying old river cold, not winter, not quite spring. That morning had the kind of chill that enters through a collar and settles between the shoulder blades, steady as an unpaid bill. Cleo had slept only a little, tucked beneath the library ledge, until the rain changed direction. Then inside a recessed doorway, near a shuttered insurance office where the stone kept some shelter and none of the warmth. The temperature, according to the bank sign she passed before sunrise, was 39 degrees. She had walked more than 4 miles since the previous evening, much of it in loops, not because she was lost, but because staying in one place too long invited questions. Before dawn she had drifted east and north along the quieter streets, then back again toward the county building when the light began to show. At 5, a bakery vent had breathed yeast and sugar into an alley, and she had stood near it with her eyes closed, letting the smell do what food could not. At 6, she drank water from the restroom sink at a gas station after buying nothing. At 7, she sat for 12 minutes under the awning of a closed barber shop, counting breaths instead of coins. On the western edge of town the night before, when the rain had first started, she had considered walking out toward the farms and finding a barn again, some structure with hay, mice, and a roof, But the bid office was in Troy, and she had learned that distance could steal more than strength. It could steal nerve. So she stayed near the place where the morning would ask something of her, and she waited with the patience of a person who has run out of alternatives. By 8:30, the streets were filling. A hardware truck turned carefully through a puddle. A woman in a navy coat unlocked a florist shop and set 2 buckets of tulips beside the door. Men with insulated coffee cups crossed against lights. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour, not close, not cleanly tuned, but enough to make Cleo lift her head. The sound spread over the roofs and thinned in the wet air. It was not a grand bell. It wavered at the edge. Still it held. She followed that sound for half a block before she realized she had turned from the office and corrected herself. The county building stood in a row of civic stone and brick, too practical to be beautiful, too old to be careless. Its entrance had double glass doors with metal handles worn bright at the centre. Inside, the lobby smelled of damp wool, floor polish, paper, and the faint mineral scent of old radiators. A directory board listed departments in black letters behind scratched plastic: treasurer records, tax maps, deeds, surplus property. Cleo stood beneath the board and read the last 2 words twice. The hallway to the surplus office was narrow, lined with framed photographs of courthouse steps, bridge dedications, ribbon cuttings, and men in dark suits standing near shovels. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Her wet boots made marks on the tile, and she turned once to see whether anyone had noticed. No one had. A clerk behind a counter was talking into a phone. Somewhere a printer began its fussy, mechanical complaint. The building seemed to run on copies, stamps, waiting chairs, and signatures given by tired hands. The surplus property office had a half-glass door with black lettering flaking at the edges. County Real Property Disposition. Beneath that, in smaller letters, tax foreclosure, sailed bids, municipal transfers. Cleo adjusted her grip on the box, knocked because the door was shut, and heard a woman call for her to come in. The room was smaller than she expected. 2 filing cabinets stood along one wall with drawers labelled by township and year. A map of Rensselaer County hung crooked above a table stacked with folders. There was a counter no higher than Cleo's waist, worn along the edge where people had rested elbows while being told things they did not want to hear. Behind it sat a woman with iron-grey hair cut in a straight bob, a mustard cardigan buttoned over a white blouse, and reading glasses hanging from a chain decorated with tiny amber beads. Her nameplate read MRS. Evelyn Harrow, County Clerk. She did not smile at first. Her face was not unkind, only exact. It had the settled look of a woman who had spent 30 years watching people come in, hoping paperwork would make hardship gentle. Her eyes moved from Cleo's wet cuffs to the box, from the scarred hands to the folded bulletin clipping held between 2 fingers, then back to Cleo's face. "Surplus bid?" she asked. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Which parcel?" Cleo unfolded the clipping and laid it on the counter. The paper had gone soft at the fold lines, but the circled listing remained readable. "Mrs." Harrow leaned forward, placed 1 finger beside the line, and grew still for half a breath. "The Bellworks Annex." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk removed her glasses, cleaned them with a square of cloth, and put them back on. It was not a delay so much as a careful changing of tools. Then she rose and went to the filing cabinet marked Troy Industrial, Misk. Her shoes made no sound on the tile. She opened the drawer, searched with 2 fingers through folders whose tabs had faded to tea colour, and drew out 1 thick manila file tied with cotton tape. When she set it down, dust lifted in a faint veil. "You understand this is not a house, Mrs." Harrow said. "Yes, ma'am." "It has no current certificate of occupancy." "Yes, ma'am." "The roof failure is documented. There may be unstable walls." "Yes, ma'am." "There are no active utilities. No water. No power. No sewer connection confirmed." "Yes, ma'am." "It is subject to demolition if the new owner does not assume responsibility and satisfy minimum safety conditions before the posted date." Cleo kept both hands on the counter because letting them hang at her sides made them tremble. Yes. Ma'am. Mrs. Harrow looked at her for a long moment. You understand the county is not repairing it for you? Yes. Ma'am, and that once transferred, any hazards on the property become yours? Yes. Ma'am. The office heater clicked, then released a dry gust of warmth that smelled faintly scorched. Cleo felt it reach her wet sleeves but not her skin. She had answered in the same voice each time because there was no other voice available. The warnings were not news. The building had been called condemned in print. A place no one wanted did not become gentle just because a person needed shelter. Mrs. Harrow turned the file toward her and opened it. Inside were photographs, inspection sheets, tax notices, a photocopy of an old plat map, and a deed form prepared with several blanks still empty. The photographs had been taken on a cloudless day, which made the damage look both clearer and more merciless. A long brick building under a failing roof, boarded windows, weeds at the threshold, a sign hanging from one chain, too blurred to read in the picture. Beyond it, a line of bare trees and the suggestion of low ground. The clerk tapped the top sheet. Minimum bid was not met by any party at the last disposition meeting. County allows direct transfer at minimum after 30 days. That is where we are, she paused. Do you have identification? Cleo gave her the expired state ID she had guarded through every night outdoors. Mrs. Harrow studied it, then studied Cleo again. Not with suspicion, but with the practical eye of someone comparing a document to a person weathered beyond its date. This address is no longer current. No. Ma'am? Do you have a mailing address? Cleo's throat worked once. Not today. The clerk took that in without changing expression. Then she reached into a drawer and drew out a pale green card. You may use general delivery at the Troy post office until you have something better. It is not perfect, but it receives mail. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. She typed for several minutes on a keyboard with several letters worn blank. The printer behind her coughed, pulled paper, and began to produce documents one page at a time. Cleo stood while the machine worked. She looked at the room because looking at the clerk felt too much like pleading. A brass stamp sat on the desk near the telephone, heavy and rectangular, its handle rubbed smooth by use. Beside it was a jar of sharpened pencils, a ceramic mug with a chipped rim, a stack of pink message slips, and a photograph of two girls in graduation gowns held upright by a magnet shaped like a pear. Mrs. Harrow placed the deed before her and turned it with the neatness of ritual. Read the buyer acknowledgement. Cleo read. The words were long, legal, and cold as is, without representation, assumption of risk, no warranty expressed or implied, environmental hazards, structural failure, public nuisance enforcement. She knew enough to understand that the document did not promise safety. It promised only that the county would stop carrying the burden and hand it to her. At the signature line, Mrs. Harrow placed a pen down. Cleo set the cardboard box on the floor because both hands were needed for this. Her fingers were stiff from cold. The skin across her knuckles tightened when she bent them. She signed slowly, keeping each letter within the line. Not because anyone had asked for beauty, but because the name was the only unbroken tool she had brought with her. Mrs. Harrow took the papers back, checked each page, and then lifted the brass stamp. The sound it made was deeper than Cleo expected. Not a click. A small, official blow. The raised seal pressed itself into the corner of the deed, and for one strange instant the office seemed to hold that sound after it had ended. Cleo could hear the radiator, the printer, a man's voice in the hallway, rainwater dripping from her hem onto the tile. Mrs. Harrow stamped 2 more pages, wrote a receipt by hand, and slid a copy across the counter. Then Cleo took the folded bill from inside the photograph and placed it on the worn counter between them. The clerk looked at it without touching it. Paper money can look lonely when it is the last of itself. This one had been folded so many times the creases were almost white. Matthias's photograph had left the faint smell of old leather and smoke on it. Or perhaps Cleo only imagined that because she needed some part of him present at the transfer. Mrs. Harrow flattened the bill with 2 fingers and opened her cash drawer. She did not drop it in at once. She laid it beneath the tray, inside a narrow compartment where odd receipts, paper clips, and a few foreign coins had collected. "You will need directions," she said. "Yes, ma'am." The clerk took out a photocopied map, marked a route with a yellow highlighter, and turned it toward Cleo. Her fingertip traced east from downtown, then north along a road that had changed names twice in the last century. Go out Congress to Pauling Avenue, then cut toward the old industrial lane near Wynant's Kill. The road is still called Foundry Spur on county records, though the street sign may not say so anymore. You will pass the cemetery wall, a row of walnut trees, and a fenced storage yard. The parcel sits beyond the second bend, before the drainage ditch. Do not go around the south wall if the ground is wet. It drops toward marsh. Cleo leaned closer. Memorizing. The front door faces west. What remains of it, Mrs.? Harrow folded the map and hesitated before giving it to her. "Your name," she said. Cleo looked up. The clerk's mouth tightened slightly, as if she had decided against one sentence and chosen another. "Maren is not common here anymore. It was my grandmother's family, from Troy. My great-uncle worked foundries here. What was his name?" The question entered the room softly and then waited there, just as the classified line had waited on the page. Cleo's first instinct was caution, because names could be mishandled by strangers. Yet Mrs. Harrow had not said it as gossip. She had said it as a person hearing a familiar tool lifted from a drawer. Silas Maren. The clerk placed both palms on the file. For several seconds, she said nothing. The hallway noise continued beyond the door. A phone rang somewhere and stopped. The fluorescent light hummed with its tired, insect sound. "My father knew a Silas Maren, Mrs. Harrow said at last. "He was a pattern maker at Meneely's for a time, then did contract tuning after the bigger work dried up. Walked with a limp by the late 70s. One clouded eye." Cleo could not answer quickly. Her hands had found the edge of the counter again. "Yes, ma'am. Mrs." Harrow's face shifted then, not into pity, but into recognition, which is a different and more dangerous kindness. "My father brought him home once to look at a cracked dinner bell from my grandfather's farm. Mr. Maren struck it with a wooden mallet and told us the bell had not failed. He said the yoke had lied to it." She gave the faintest breath that might, in another woman, have become a laugh. "I was 8. I never forgot that." Cleo looked down because the office had grown too clear. "He taught me sand," she said. "Mrs. Harrow nodded slowly. "Then he taught you something worth more than this file." The clerk reached to a side drawer and removed a small envelope. From it she took a key on a plain ring, darkened almost black with age. It was not a fine key. It had a square bow, a long worn shaft, and teeth softened by use. She set it on the deed copy. This was recovered from the lockbox when the parcel came back to the county. "I do not know what it opens." The inspector said the front padlock was newer. "There may be interior doors." She paused. "Do not force anything that resists. Buildings speak before they fall." Cleo closed her hand around the key. Its cold went straight into her palm. "Thank you," she said again, though the clerk had warned her not to. "Mrs." Harrow pretended not to hear. She wrote something on the outside of the file, initialed it, and tied the cotton tape back into a bow when Cleo lifted her box. The clerk came around the counter and opened the office door for her. Not wide, not ceremonially, only enough to make the leaving easier. At the threshold, "Mrs." Harrow spoke once more. "If anyone asks." You have until the first inspection notice to secure hazards. Board loose openings. Post no trespassing. Keep receipts for materials. Take photographs before every repair. Yes. Ma'am. Pick, ma'am. Grab. Then and Miss Voss. Cleo stopped. The clerk looked toward the hallway, then back. If the roof groans, leave. Cleo nodded. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist that seemed to hang rather than fall. She stood beneath the county building's shallow overhang with the deed folded inside her shirt, the map in her pocket, and the key held so tightly its ring marked her skin. She had thought ownership might feel like a door opening. Instead, it felt like being handed a weight and told it was yours to carry with both arms. She began walking. The route out of downtown led past the habits of ordinary life, which that morning seemed more mysterious than any ruin. A pharmacy with Easter candy in the window, a pawn shop with guitars hanging behind glass, a diner called the River Cup, where a waitress in a red apron wiped a counter while 3 men leaned over plates of eggs, a dry cleaner with a bell over the door that rang whenever customers entered, a hardware store called Harrow and Sons, though its sign was weathered enough that the ampersand had faded first, a florist still arranging tulips in buckets, their petals closed against the damp. Cleo passed them slowly, because the box cut into her hip and because every place with a lit interior reminded her she did not yet have one. At the diner, the smell of bacon and coffee followed her half a block. At the hardware store, she stopped long enough to study the window display. Tarps, rope, work gloves, glass panes, stovepipe elbows, a row of hammers hung in graded sizes. A bell attached to the door handle moved in the wind, but did not ring. She touched the folded deed through her shirt and kept walking. The sidewalk gave way to rougher pavement. Houses stood farther apart. Their porches had peeling rails, bicycles under tarps, plastic toys left rain-bright in yards, and muddy patches where spring grass had not yet returned. A dog behind a chain-link fence followed her progress with a hoarse, dutiful bark, stopping only when she turned her face toward him. He was brown, barrel-chested, and old enough to have a white muzzle. After a moment he lowered his head and watched her without sound. Near the cemetery wall the road narrowed. The stones were dark with rain, and names carved into them appeared and disappeared behind iron fencing and budded shrubs. Cleo did not stop, but she slowed. She had always thought cemeteries were honest places because they did not pretend the body could keep every promise. Beyond the wall, a row of walnut trees leaned over the road, their branches still bare, their trunks ridged and damp. Last year's leaves lay flattened in the ditch, black, brown and slick, giving off a smell like wet paper soil and something older. At the second bend, the road lost confidence. The pavement broke into patches. Gravel appeared in the centre where tyres rarely passed. To the right stood a fenced storage yard with stacked pallets, rusted drums and a yellow loader with one flat tyre. To the left, low ground opened toward reeds and standing water. A red-winged blackbird clung to a cattail stem and gave one metallic call that seemed too bright for the weather. Farther ahead, partly hidden by saplings and wild grapevine, the building waited. Cleo stopped before she reached the gate. It was longer than the photograph had shown, one story for most of its length, built of brick darkened by coal smoke and river seasons. The west wall held 3 tall arched openings boarded from inside, and a central doorway framed in stone worn smooth at the lower edges. The roofline sagged near the middle where rafters had failed and slate had slid inward. A brick chimney rose from the rear section, square and stubborn, with a crown cracked down one side. Iron brackets remained along the wall where an awning or hoist beam had once projected. Above the entrance, a wooden sign hung by a single chain, turned slightly away from the road. She stepped closer and read what was left. Maren Vale, Bell Metal Works, Annex. The letters were faded, gold paint turned mustard and grey, but the first name had survived with a clarity that made the wet air sharpen around it. Cleo stood with the box against her and did not move. Maren. Not rare anymore because a clerk remembered it. Not lost because Roland had called everything scrap. Not alive in any ordinary sense, but present, kept. The gate was not locked, only held shut by a loop of wire twisted through 2 rusted eyes. She set the box down, worked the wire loose and pushed. The hinges protested in a low, reluctant sound. Grass had grown through the gravel drive. Broken slate lay near the threshold. A blue tarp, shredded by weather, flapped from a nail high on the wall. Near the door, someone had nailed a county notice under plastic, the red letters blurred by condensation but still legible enough. Condemned, unsafe structure, entry prohibited. Cleo read it. Then she looked at the key in her hand. The front padlock was indeed newer, orange with rust but not original. The key did not fit, she had expected that. A length of chain looped through the hasp, but the staple had pulled partly free from the rotten jamb. She did not break it. She did not need to. The right-hand door, swollen by years of damp, had opened a finger's width where the lower hinge failed. Cleo set her shoulder against it and pushed carefully, feeling for give, listening for shift. The wood resisted. Then, something inside let go with a soft sigh of dust, and the door opened enough for her to slip through sideways with the box held before her. The first smell was not rot. That surprised her. It was mineral and dry beneath the damp like clay, ash, cold brick and iron left untouched. There was rot, too, somewhere above, where roof water had fed beams past saving, but it did not own the room. The foundry held a deeper scent, dark and patient, as though heat had once entered the walls and never entirely departed. Cleo stood just inside until her eyes adjusted. The front room had been an office once, or a receiving room. Its plaster walls had failed in broad patches, exposing lath darkened by time. A counter remained along one side, bowed at the centre. Behind it, pigeon droppings marked the floor beneath a hole near the ceiling. There was a desk with one drawer missing, 2 chairs with cane seats broken through, a calendar nailed to the wall and curled into itself so tightly no year could be seen. Dust lay everywhere, but not evenly. Wind had drawn lines in it. Small animals had written their own passages across the floor. The second physical truth was cold. Not outdoor cold which moves, indoor cold which waits. It had collected in the brick, the floor, the desk, the metal corners of old shelving. and the water pooled in a shallow pan someone had left beneath a leak years before. Cleo's breath showed faintly when she exhaled. She set the box on the counter because the floor near the doorway seemed uncertain, then stood still and listened. No groan. No settling. Only drops, far back. One at a time, she crossed the front room carefully, testing each board before trusting it. Her boots left dark prints in the dust. A doorway without a door opened into the larger rear room. And there, the Foundry revealed what the photograph had hidden. The casting floor was broad and low, perhaps 40 feet by 60, with a partial overhead frame where the roof remained, and an open wound of sky where it did not. Rain had come through for years, but not everywhere. Near the centre, black casting sand lay in drifts and shallow ridges, hardened in some places, loose in others. It covered the floor like a strange indoor shore. Brick furnace bases stood along the east wall, their arches cold and empty. A rusted rail ran overhead for a travelling hoist that was no longer there. Patterns, flasks, and broken mouldboards leaned against the rear wall. Some had collapsed into themselves. Some still held their shape with a dignity that made Cleo step around them as if they were sleeping. To the left was a workbench thick with dust and grey mouse tracks. To the right, a lathe bed stood stripped of its motor, its long iron ways rusted but recognisable. She knew enough to understand what had been stolen. Belts gone, pulleys gone, crucibles gone, lift tackle gone. Anything easy to sell had been removed, and some things not easy at all. Whoever had emptied the place had taken value by weight and left knowledge where it was too plain to notice. Cleo touched the lathe with 2 fingers. The cold metal answered through her scars. A bell-tuning lathe did not look sacred when abandoned. It looked like work interrupted by people who did not intend to return. But Silas had described such machines in winter kitchens, drawing with a pencil on butcher paper, explaining how a bell was mounted mouth outward, how the cutter took whisper-thin ribbons from the inner profile, how 5 principal tones had to be coaxed into relation: hum, prime, tierce, quint, nominal. He had made the words sound like relatives around a table, each with a temper, each needing to be heard. Cleo withdrew her hand. The back room had another door, narrower, leading to what might have been a storage bay or washroom. She did not enter it yet. Light was already weakening, and she needed a place where the roof was sound enough for one night. The office floor near the counter was dry. Not clean, not safe in any official sense, but dry. She carried the box back, swept a rectangle with the side of her boot, and pulled the broken chairs together to block the worst draught from the door gap. From the box she took 1 shirt, folded it into a pillow, and unrolled the canvas tools beside her. There was no stove she could use yet, no water, no lock that held, no mattress except cardboard. She ate nothing because there was nothing to eat, and drank the last of the water from the jar the farmer's wife had given her 2 nights before. The glass was cloudy and smelled faintly of hay. When it was empty, she set it near the counter, as though placing a cup in a kitchen that belonged to someone. Dusk came without colour. Through the broken upper portion of the front window, she could see the walnut branches moving against the sky. A car passed once on the road and did not slow. The dog barked from far away 3 times, then gave up. Rain returned in a lighter form, tapping on slate, tarp, exposed rafters, and the metal pan in the rear room. Each surface made its own note: tin, wood, water, brick, air. Cleo lay on her side with the deed inside her shirt and the unknown key under her palm. The floor smelled of dust and old sand. Her hip ached where the boards pressed through her coat. Her hands hurt from cold in the way scar tissue does, a private tightening no one else can see. She did not pray in words. She did not make promises to the building or to the dead. She listened until the separate sounds of rain became one settled hush. The Foundry had been waiting. And now Cleo had come. Morning entered the Foundry through broken places first, not through windows in any honest way. It came pale along the gap in the roof, silvering the edges of rafters where rain had darkened them overnight. It touched the black sand on the casting floor and made the surface look briefly like water before the light shifted and the grains returned to themselves. Cleo woke with one cheek against her folded shirt, the unknown key still under her palm, and a stiffness down her side that did not leave when she sat up. For a moment she listened before moving, because the building had made its own language in the night, and she needed to know whether any new sound had joined it. Only dripping. Only a pigeon somewhere above the office ceiling, settling its wings. She rose slowly and folded the shirt, then shook dust from her coat. The deed had stayed inside her blouse, warm from her body, and she removed it only long enough to check that the pages had not dampened. Her first day as owner began with no ceremony beyond finding where the water came from and where a person might relieve herself without making the place more ruined than it already was. There was no working well on the parcel, but there was a hand pump behind the rear wall, half hidden by dead burdock and rusted pipe. The handle resisted when she tried it. She worked it with both hands, one careful pull at a time, and after the 5th stroke the pump gave a hollow cough from deep in its throat. After the 12th brown water spat onto the stones, smelling of iron and old depth. She did not drink it. Not yet. She filled the cloudy jar, let the water settle, and set it aside on a flat brick to see what the bottom would carry. Beyond the pump, near a stand of sumac, an outhouse leaned slightly away from the building as though ashamed of having survived. Its door hung crooked on leather hinges gone hard with age. Inside was a wooden seat, a wasp nest no longer alive, and a Sears catalogue from another decade so swollen by damp that it had become one solid object. Cleo cleaned it with a stick, a broken board, and a strip torn from the hem of a shirt she could not keep carrying. She propped the door with a stone. She found a path to it and marked the worst hole in the ground with a length of fallen branch. The first 3 days were built from such small negotiations. She learned which boards in the front room gave a low complaint but held, and which ones answered with a hollow crack beneath the dust. She learned that the left side of the office stayed dry in rain from the west, but not in rain from the south. She learned that a gap under the front door let wind travel along the floor and rise near her shoulder at night, so she pressed a collapsed ledger, several pieces of cardboard and the broken cane seat of a chair against it after dusk. She learned that if she walked along the east wall of the casting room, keeping her steps on the brick border and not in the sand, the floor stayed firm. If she crossed the middle, something beneath shifted softly, not a collapse yet, but the memory of one. On the 2nd day she found a broom with half its straw missing and used it anyway. She swept a narrow path from the front door to the office counter, then from the office into the casting room, then from the casting room to the back door. The broom raised dust so old it seemed reluctant to leave the floor. She tied a damp cloth over her nose and mouth, opened what openings could be opened, and worked only an hour before stopping, because her throat warned her. Silas had taught her that stubbornness is not strength when air turns against you. At noon that day, the pump water had settled enough to show rust flakes at the bottom and a clearer inch above. She did not trust it. She walked back toward town with the jar empty, following the cracked road, the walnut trees, the cemetery wall, and the dog who barked once and then decided she was part of the morning. At the first public restroom she found, she washed the jar 3 times and filled it. She drank from the sink with both hands cupped, then stood there while her body remembered what enough water felt like. On the 3rd day, hunger became less a pain than a weather system. It moved behind her ribs. It slowed her work. She found 2 dimes, a nickel and a penny, in the missing drawer space of the office desk, all green at the edges and bearing dates rubbed thin. She put them in her pocket, not because they would buy much, but because found money, however modest, is a kind of permission to keep looking. Then she took the photocopied map, folded small, and walked into Troy to find the hardware store she had passed on the way out. Harrow Sons smelled of linseed oil, cut keys, cardboard, seed packets, and the metallic coolness of bins filled with nails. The bell over the door did ring this time, a brief high note too cheerful for the work ahead. Inside, the store ran long and narrow, with aisles made by shelves that had been repaired rather than replaced. Wooden drawers behind the counter were labelled in black paint, brass screws, cotter pins, roofing nails, mason line, sash cord. A rack of axe handles stood near the window. Mason jars held washers sorted by size. Near the stove, an aging orange cat slept on a folded feed sack with one paw over its face. The man behind the counter was tall but stooped, with thick white hair combed straight back and eyebrows the same colour as steel wool. His shirt sleeves were buttoned at the wrist, his hands were large, dry and square-fingered, marked by small cuts healed over many seasons. A name stitched above his pocket read Nathaniel, though the receipt pad beside him had Harrow, N printed at the top. He was sharpening a carpenter's pencil with a pocket knife when Cleo entered. He looked up, took in the wet hem of her coat, the scarred hands, the tool roll under one arm, and the way she moved through the store, not like a customer browsing, but like someone trying to understand prices before touching anything. "You are the one who bought the annex," he said. Cleo stopped near the bins of nails. "Yes, sir. My sister said you might come. Mrs. Harrow had a brother. Then—" Cleo placed that fact carefully among the others. It did not feel unsafe. "Not yet. I need to know what things cost," she said. Nathaniel Harrow folded the pocket knife and set the pencil down. "Most people start by telling me what they want. I do not know what I can afford. That is a truer answer." He came around the counter slowly, favouring his left knee, and handed her a clipboard with blank paper already clipped to it. The gesture was ordinary enough to be merciful. He did not ask where she slept. He did not ask whether she had money. He led her down the first aisle and pointed. Not selling, only naming. Roof tarp, 8 by 10, $6.99, cheap one. It will tear by June if the wind gets under it. 10 by 12, $9.49. Better grommets, mason twine, $1.75. 16-penny common nails, by the pound, $2.20. Roofing nails, galvanized, $3.10. Work gloves, cheapest pair is $4, but the seams split. Do not buy those if you're handling slate. Cleo wrote each price in small, exact numbers. "What about a chimney brush?" He looked at her. "What size flue?" "I have not measured." "Then do not buy the brush yet." He took her to a rack of pamphlets and old manuals near the back. Most were printed by tool companies or state extension offices, faded at the corners, free once and now forgotten. He pulled one from the middle and dusted it on his sleeve. Home Structure Repair for Rural Outbuildings, revised 1974. Its cover showed a man in a plaid shirt pointing at a diagram of roof pitch. "You can have this." Cleo held it as if it might be withdrawn. "I cannot pay for it." "I said have. I need to keep account." "Then keep account." He reached beneath the counter and brought out a ruled notebook. Opening it to the first blank page after several filled with names, dates, and tidy columns. "What name shall I write?" She gave it. He wrote slowly, then looked up. "I do not run credit for everyone." "No, sir. My sister said your great-uncle tuned my grandfather's bell." Cleo said nothing because any answer would have been too large for the aisle. Nathaniel tapped the pencil once against the page. "Credit here is not charity. It is a way of allowing a job to begin before all its money has arrived. You bring receipts. You write what you take. And when you can pay something, you pay something. I do not know when that will be. I did not ask when." The orange cat woke, stretched, and stepped down from the feed sack with elderly dignity. It walked to Cleo, sniffed the damp hem of her coat, and pressed its side against her boot, as if claiming her for the store. Nathaniel watched this and nodded once, though whether at the cat or the account she could not tell. "What do you need first?" he asked. She looked at the manual. "To keep more rain out. To clean a flue without setting the building on fire. To make one room warmer than outside. That is 3 jobs. Not one." "Yes, sir." He wrote a list with prices as carefully as if he were drafting a will. One 10 by 12 roof tarp, $9.49. 1 bundle of furring strips, 12 pieces at 89 cents each. 2 pounds galvanized roofing nails, $6.20. 1 ball mason twine, $1.75. 1 roll black stove gasket, $4.98. One wire hand brush, $2.49. One flat cold chisel, used $1. One dust mask, 59 cents. One box kitchen matches, 39 cents. One small tin of stove polish, dented, marked down to 75 cents. Two cans pork and beans from the grocery shelf near the register, 89 cents each, because he said a person working under a roof could not repair one while faint. Total, including sales tax where the register insisted on it, $43.17. Cleo looked at the number until it steadied. "I can carry some now," she said. "You can carry what matters now." He separated the list without asking. The manual, the dust mask, the wire brush, the used chisel, the matches, the two cans, a short length of twine cut from an already open ball, which he did not ring, a folded scrap of sandpaper, a pencil. He placed these in a paper bag and wrote the account total in the ruled notebook, not the register. "Come back after you have measured the roof opening and the flue," he said. "Guessing buys twice." Cleo nodded. "At the door," he added. "Do you know how to clean a chimney?" "Not well enough." "That answer may keep you alive. Read first. Work slow. If the soot is shiny, treat it like danger." She carried the bag back beneath a clearing sky, the food heavy as mercy against her side. When she reached the foundry, she did not eat immediately. Hunger wanted that, but hunger had become only one voice among many. She set the cans on the office counter and opened the manual to the chapter on chimneys. She read the first 2 pages standing, then she sat on the floor and read them again. The language was plain and practical, describing soot, creosote, bird nests, cracked liners, draft, clean outdoors, and the dry patience required before flame was allowed in a neglected flue. The chimney at the rear of the building served an iron stove in a side room she had not fully entered. That room had once been a finishing space, maybe later a break room, with a narrow flue thimble entering the brick stack and a cast-iron stove squat as a bulldog beneath it. The stove was rusted but whole. Its legs stood on a sheet of metal over the plank floor. The door hinges moved after she brushed them, stiffly at first, then better. Inside lay ash compacted by years of damp grey at the top, black beneath, and a dead bird folded into itself near the back. She removed the bird with 2 pieces of cardboard and buried it under the sumac because leaving it in the stove felt careless. Then she cleaned ash into a bucket made from a paint can with the handle still attached. The ash was heavier than it looked. It held damp near the bottom, and the smell rose mineral, bitter, and old. The clean-out door in the chimney base was behind a stack of broken mould-boards. She moved them one by one, noting which had usable edges, which were too rotten, which had pattern marks stamped into them. The clean-out door resisted until she worked the chisel gently under the latch and tapped it with the heel of her hand. A fall of soot came out in a soft black sigh, spreading across the floor. She stepped back and waited until the dust settled before she touched it again. Nathaniel had been right. Some of it was powder, some was shiny and tar-like, glazed along the inner brick where water and smoke had once met badly. Creosote, not just dirt, but stored fire. She put on the mask and tied the damp cloth over it, because one layer seemed too little. Without a chimney brush, she could not do the full job from the top, but she could begin where danger had gathered low. For 6 hours, broken by rests, she worked from the bottom upward as far as her arm and the wire brush could reach. Brush, scrape, withdraw, let dust fall, scoop, wait, brush again. She used the chisel only where the glossy deposits lifted in flakes, never against bricks soft enough to crumble. At noon, she walked outside and breathed cold air until her head cleared. At 2, she returned and used a length of furring strip found under the bench to extend the brush by wrapping it with wire from an old crate. It was not elegant. It worked 3 feet higher. Near dusk, she climbed the rear wall ladder built into the brick, testing every rung before trusting weight. Halfway up, she stopped because fear had gone practical in her knees. The roof near the chimney still held, but the slate was slick, and she had no business pretending courage made footing safer. She came down. That decision felt like failure for 10 minutes. Then she read the manual again and understood that coming down alive was part of the method. The next morning she returned to Harrow and Sons with soot still under her nails and measured dimensions written on the back of the county map. Nathaniel sold her, on account, a 6-inch square chimney brush with a threaded handle, 3 fiberglass rods, and a better dust mask. He did not comment on the black at her cuffs. He only said, top down when you can, bottom up when you must. Never light until air proves itself. How does air prove itself? He took a wooden match from a box, unlit, and held it upright. Small flame at the stove mouth. If smoke comes at you, the chimney is still refusing. If it pulls away, it is thinking. She carried the brush home like an instrument. It took the rest of that day and half of the next to finish. She waited for dry weather, climbed to the roof edge by the most solid route, and crawled rather than walked over the slate that remained. The chimney crown was cracked but not falling. She fed the brush down in careful lengths, twisting clockwise, never forcing. Soot fell below in waves. Once the brush caught, and she backed it out slowly until whatever had resisted gave way and dropped with a hollow knock into the clean-out. A bird nest, then a rind of black glaze, then another rain of powder. By the time she finished, her arms shook from overhead work and her throat felt lined with bitter dust despite the mask. She cleaned the stove again, checked the pipe joint, packed a gap with the stove gasket, and left everything open for an hour. At last, with twilight gathering beyond the broken roof, she placed 3 twists of newspaper, a handful of dry splinters from a fallen crate, and 1 narrow piece of old pine inside the stove. She struck a match. The first flame bent sideways, weak and uncertain. Smoke touched the stove mouth, hesitated, and then drew inward. Not strongly. Enough. Cleo knelt on the floor with both hands braced on her knees and watched the draft take hold. The newspaper blackened, folded, became ember. The splinters caught. The pine gave a small pop. Heat, actual heat, began at the centre of the stove and moved outward in rings, first visible only in the brightening of flame, then felt against her face, then against her hands when she held them near the iron. She did not build a large fire. She fed it like something recovering from illness. When the stove had warmed through without smoking into the room, she opened 1 can of pork and beans with a rusted opener found in the office drawer, and set the can on a flat stone near the stove door. The smell rose slowly, sweet, salty, and plain. It filled the finishing room more gently than smoke had. She ate with a spoon Nathaniel had tucked into the paper bag without writing it down, taking small mouthfuls so her body would not revolt against sudden plenty. That was her first hot meal in the Foundry. After eating, she washed the spoon with a little water, wiped it dry, and placed it on the counter as if there would be breakfast. Then she slept near the stove, not close enough for danger, close enough that warmth reached her knees through the coat. The building still dripped, wind still entered where it pleased, but 1 room had become warmer than outside, and this changed the scale of every task. On the 5th morning, Cleo began the inventory. She did it the way Silas had taught every careful search, left to right, near to far, nothing lifted twice without naming it once. She found 2 partial wooden bell patterns, 1 cracked along the crown, 1 split at the lip, 3 flask sides with iron corner brackets still attached, a bent cope bar, 2 riddles for sifting sand, 1 torn and 1 usable if patched, 6 pattern boards marked with chalk numbers that had survived under grime, a bucket of chaplets rusted together in a brown mass, a shelf of core irons, some straight, some twisted, a rack of files, most missing, 2 present and serviceable after cleaning, 1 pair of tongs with a sprung jaw, a wooden mallet with a handle worn by a hand larger than hers, a broken pyrometer case with no probe, 3 brass tags stamped with job numbers, 1 ledger 2 mould damaged to open safely, 2 sacks of fire clay gone hard as stone, a coil of wire, a drawer of shims, 4 wedges, 9 bolts, 11 washers, no crucibles. The lathe remained the centre of her attention because absence had made it conspicuous. Someone had stripped motor belt, chuck hardware, and tool post accessories, but the bed itself was too heavy or too awkward to steal. Its ways were rusted but not pitted beyond hope. The tailstock had been left on the floor beneath the bench. She cleaned a patch of iron with sandpaper and oil, not to repair it yet, only to see whether a shine remained under neglect. It did dull, but there, in the casting room, the black sand told stories of interrupted labour. Some areas had footprints hardened into them, boots not hers, likely inspectors, scrappers, perhaps boys daring each other years ago. Other areas were undisturbed, especially near the rear east corner, where broken moulds had been stacked under a surviving section of roof. Cleo avoided that corner on the first days because it seemed too crowded with unstable shapes. On the 6th, after the stove had made her bold enough to continue, she carried a lantern borrowed on account from Nathaniel and began there. The rejected moulds stood in a row, all clay, loam, straw and sand, built around interior forms now long gone or collapsed. Some were small enough to have held farm bells, others were fragments only, curved walls broken like sections of giant eggshell. At the farthest end, under a sheet of tar paper stiffened by time, stood a mould unlike the rest. It was large enough that Cleo stopped before it. Not a complete bell mould ready for pour, but an outer cope form, fired hard, thick-walled and shaped to receive a bell of considerable size. Its surface had been brushed with a wash that left it reddish-brown beneath soot. A crack ran down one side, which likely explained why it had been rejected. Around its base black sand had built up in a crescent, and a cedar disc rested against the lower opening, warped but still fitted closely enough to seem intentional. She held the lantern higher. On the outside of the mould, someone had scratched a mark into the clay before firing, a small circle crossed by a vertical line and two short arcs, like a bell seen in simplest form. Beneath it were numbers, faint under dust. 134, or 1939. She brushed lightly. 1934. She tapped the side of the mould with her knuckle. The sound was dull, as expected. Thick clay, empty form. She moved around it, careful where the floor dipped, and tapped again near the crack. Dull. Then at the lower rear quadrant, just above the cedar disc, the sound changed, not hollow in the ordinary way. Held, she tapped again with the wooden handle of the wire brush. A different note answered, short and enclosed, as if the mould contained another surface set back from the outer wall. Cleo stilled. She tapped above it. Dull. Beside it. Dull. Below it, the same held note. Her breath slowed. The weight test came next because sound alone could be deceptive in a room full of broken forms. She tried to shift a smaller mould nearby and felt its expected lightness for fired clay that had lost its core. Then she placed both hands against the giant mould and pushed, not hard enough to risk tipping, only enough to ask whether it wanted to move. It did not. That too could mean size, damp, sand packed around the base. She cleared the crescent with a scrapboard until the bottom edge appeared. The cedar disc was wedged into a circular recess that did not belong to the mould's purpose. It had been fitted after firing. Cleo knelt. The disc was dark with age, its grain raised, its rim sealed with a blackened material that looked at first like tar. She touched it with the tip of the chisel. It did not flake. Wax, maybe. Heat-resistant sealing wax mixed with ash or pitch. Around the edge, 3 small clay plugs had been pressed over what might be screws or pegs. She sat back on her heels. A person alone in a condemned building learns to distrust luck. Luck can be a rotten board that looks sound. It can be a stranger with a smile and a contract folded in his pocket. It can be hunger making a shape in dust seem like a sign. She set the chisel down and did not open anything for nearly an hour. Instead, she finished inventorying the rest of the corner. 2 mould boards, a cracked ladle handle, a wooden wedge, a bird skull, a length of rope that turned to fibre when touched, all ordinary, all waiting. Then she returned to the cedar disc. She warmed the sealing wax, not with flame but with patience, holding her palm near it after rubbing the surface, then using the chisel edge to test where the old material had lost grip. It came away in small dark curls. Under the first clay plug was a brass screw, green at the slot but whole. Under the second, another. The third broke and took a sliver of clay with it, making her stop until the crack settled. No shift followed. She found a screwdriver in the office desk, too wide at first, so she filed its tip against a stone until it seated better. Each screw turned a fraction, resisted, turned again. She did not force. She worked them loose over 20 minutes, breathing through the small impatience that rises when a secret agrees to exist but not yet to be known. The cedar disc came free with a soft inward sigh. Behind it was not open hollow, but a clay-lined compartment built into the thickness of the mould, dark, dry, and sealed from weather. Inside lay 3 packages wrapped in oilcloth, 1 smaller tin box, and a roll of stiff paper tied with linen tape. No light had touched them in longer than Cleo could imagine without making time unreal. The air that came out smelled of cedar, wax, old paper, and something faintly metallic. She did not reach in at once. Her hands, for the first time since the county office, were not steady. She stood, walked to the stove-room, drank water, and returned with the lantern and the cleanest cloth she owned. Then she removed the packages one by one and laid them on the workbench after wiping a space clear. The first package was heavy for its size. The oilcloth cracked at the folds but held. Inside lay tools wrapped separately in soft cotton, a pair of small inside calipers, a tuning scraper with a curved blade, 3 hand gravers, a machinist's rule, a set of feeler gauges darkened but complete, and a little brass plumb bob shaped like a pear. Each tool bore the same scratched craft mark as the mould, small and deliberate. Cleo touched the calipers and felt Silas's kitchen table so strongly that she had to set them down. The second package held raw material, not much but chosen. 6 bronze ingots no larger than bars of soap, each stamped with a ratio mark, 78 CUs divided by 22 SN, Bell bronze. There was also a folded paper packet of powdered charcoal, a small linen bag of parting dust, and 2 wax sticks wrapped in paper gone yellow. The ingots had dulled to brown gold, but where one edge had rubbed against another, a warmer colour showed. The metal waited without apology. The third package held notebooks. Not ledgers in the usual sense, though money appeared in margins and dates marched through some pages. These were working books written by a hand that valued exactness over beauty. Each page contained measurements, profiles, weights, diameters, wall thicknesses, pour temperatures, cooling notes, tuning corrections, and sound frequencies written beside bell names or job numbers. Some entries were from churches, some from schools, some from ships. One page listed 5 tones across the top and columns beneath them, figures changing by small increments until the final line was circled. Perfect interval at last. Cleo did not understand all of it. Not yet. But she knew enough to recognize a life's listening when she saw it. The books were not recipes alone. They were proof that someone had spent years hearing what others missed, and then writing it down before silence took him. The tin box remained. It was rectangular, painted once in dark green, now worn to bare metal at the corners. The lid had been sealed with a strip of waxed cloth and tied with twine that snapped when she touched it. Inside, beneath another piece of cotton, lay money, not one stack. Many bills folded into envelopes, silver coins wrapped in paper rolls, a cloth pouch with a drawstring, a small bank book with pages filled and no recent stamps. Cleo sat down before she touched any of it. The room seemed to lean closer. Rainwater dropped somewhere beyond the casting floor, one sound at long intervals, exact as a clock too slow for ordinary life. She opened the first envelope. $5 bills, old series, soft at the edges, counted in pencil on the flap. She counted them anyway. Her lips moved without sound. The second envelope held 10s, the third held 20s. The fourth was marked taxes, though no tax office had received it. The fifth held a single 50 wrapped in tissue, as if its owner had not trusted larger bills, but had kept this one from necessity. The silver rolls came next. Mercury dimes, their winged heads worn smooth on some and sharp on others. Standing Liberty quarters, dates hard to read, walking Liberty $half that seemed too beautiful for money, each figure striding into sun so small it fit between thumb and forefinger. In the cloth pouch were coins older still, 2 Morgan dollars, 1 piece dollar, several Indian head cents, and a 3-cent nickel so thin and strange Cleo held it only by the edge. At the bottom of the tin lay a bronze medal on a faded ribbon. Not bronze for bells, but military bronze, dark from time and handling. On the back was a name she did not yet know, a unit, and the year 1918. The ribbon had lost its true colour, but not its dignity. She placed it apart from the money, near the tools, because it did not belong in a count. The counting took the rest of the afternoon. She made columns in the back of the hardware manual because there was no other clean paper she trusted, bills by denomination, coins by type, bank book balance not counted until she could understand whether it was still claimable, which she suspected it was not. Loose cents she counted twice, then once more after eating the second can cold because her hands had begun to shake too badly for arithmetic, when the final number stood before her. Written in pencil and checked 3 times, it seemed less like wealth than like weather held underground. $38,000.76. Cleo stared at the number until the digits stopped being figures and became labour, not fortune, labour wages not spent, jobs paid in cash, repairs made and money tucked away, a winter gone without something needed, a woman or a man or a family choosing secrecy over trust because the world outside the mould had become unsafe for what they knew. She gathered the money back into its envelopes and cloth rolls with care, not hurried, not hungry-handed. The coins clicked softly, and each sound made the room feel more occupied, not by ghosts but by decisions. She returned the bills to the tin, the coins beside them, the medal on top wrapped in cotton. The notebooks she left out because closing them felt wrong, the tools she lined in order on the clean cloth, their shapes familiar and foreign at once. The roll of stiff paper tied with linen tape still lay unopened. It had been behind the packages, flatter than the others, and placed against the rear wall of the compartment. On the outside, in brown ink faded nearly to the colour of the paper itself, was written one word: letter. Cleo sat with it in both hands. The room had dimmed, evening had entered through the roof wound and filled the casting floor with blue-grey shadow. The stove was cold because she had forgotten to tend it. Her body wanted heat, wanted food, wanted the animal reassurance of knowing whether the paper held warning or welcome. But some things lose meaning if entered at the wrong hour. She had counted money in hunger and handled tools in trembling. She would not read a dead person's letter while fear and astonishment were still crowding the door. She placed the letter on the workbench beside the notebooks and set the tin box under the counter, hidden behind 2 warped boards until she could make a better place. Then she carried the lantern outside. The air had cleared after rain. Beyond the Foundry, low water lay in the marsh holding a pale strip of sky. Reeds stood black against it, somewhere near the ditch. Frogs had begun their spring calling, not loudly yet, but with the cautious tuning of a season not fully convinced it had arrived. Cleo walked to the edge of the wet ground and stood where Mrs. Harrow had warned her not to go farther. The mud accepted the soles of her boots and held them gently. Across the water the last light touched the backs of the walnut trees. Their branches were still bare, but at their tips small buds had begun, tight and dark, waiting for warmth with no visible impatience. The Foundry behind her gave off no light except the lantern set near the door. From outside it looked no less ruined than it had that morning. A stranger passing the road would have seen a condemned structure, a slumped roof, a young woman in a worn coat standing alone near marsh water at dusk. Cleo watched the water until the shaking in her hands passed. She did not make plans for the money. She did not imagine escape. She did not imagine Roland learning anything. The thought of him came and went like a crow crossing high above a field, black and brief, belonging to another weather. What remained was the sound the mould had made when tapped in the right place, and the way the sealed compartment had opened, not like a treasure chest, but like a kept promise, finally asked a careful question. When the cold reached through her coat, she went back inside. barred the door as well as she could, and lay near the stove with the unopened letter wrapped in cloth beside her shoulder. The Foundry had been waiting, and now Cleo had come. Morning found the paper exactly where Cleo had left it, wrapped in cloth on the workbench, guarded by no lock except her own restraint. The stove had gone out in the night. A grey seam of ash lay behind the little iron door, and the room held that peculiar cold that follows a fire, colder somehow because warmth had been known there and had withdrawn. Cleo woke on the floor with her coat pulled to her chin, listening to the first trucks passing far off on the road. The Foundry was not silent. No building with a split roof and old brick lungs can be silent, but it had settled into a hush deep enough that the smallest sounds appeared with edges. A drip in the casting room. A mouse within the office wall. Her own breath. She sat up and did not touch the letter at once. First she rebuilt the fire with yesterday's coals, a twist of paper, and splinters shaved from a broken crate. She pumped water, let it settle, and used the clearest top inch to wash soot from her fingers. She ate the last cold beans with the borrowed spoon, then cleaned the spoon and placed it beside the tools. These small acts mattered. A person should not open the words of the dead with hunger making demands and dirt speaking louder than memory. Only after the stove took draught and the iron began to tick faintly did she sit at the bench. The paper had been tied with linen tape, not string. It was good paper, thick, cream-coloured once, now darkened along the edges. When she loosened the knot, the fibres gave a dry whisper, and the folded pages relaxed only a little, as if they had been holding themselves closed for decades by habit. The ink had browned but not vanished. The handwriting was narrow, slanted and exact, with tall letters that leaned forward like someone walking into wind. Cleo knew that hand. Not from any document she had seen whole, from fragments. Labels on pattern boards, numbers on the bell metal ingots, a margin note in the first notebook. The same discipline lived in every line, the same refusal to waste space or feeling. She touched the first page only by its lower corner and smoothed it flat along the original crease. Then she read, "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have opened the old rejected mould, and if you have opened that, you have either been taught patience or been made desperate enough to learn it quickly. I do not know which of those brought you here, perhaps both. I will write to you as kin, though I cannot know your face, because only kin in blood, craft, or need would think to listen inside a broken thing. My name is Abigail Maren Vale. I was born in this city in 1881 in a house that smelled of river mud, coal smoke, and wet wool every spring. In March of 1934, Dr. Emmett Shaw at Albany Hospital told me the shadow in my lungs had grown past argument. He said there might be months if I rested. I smiled at him because men who say rest have often never seen rent come due. I came home by train, made tea, and began deciding what should outlive me. Our line begins, as I was told it, with Thomas Maren, who came from Mechelen in 1846 with a chest of tools and 2 shirts. He had learned bell work where bells were treated as voices, not products. His son, Peter Thomas Maren, born in Troy in 1852, married Eliza Went, whose father kept furnace accounts in West Troy. Peter cast farm bells, school bells, and 2 courthouse bells before his hands shook too badly for ladle work. My father, Jonathan Maren, born in 1874, joined with Elias Vale in 1898, and together they built the annex you now stand in, because the larger shops would take orders and leave the careful work to men whose names were not painted on wagons. I, Abigail, learned first by sweeping, then by ramming sand, then by listening at the tuning lathe when my father pretended not to notice. The day the trade closed here was October 17th, 1919. Remember that date. The armistice had been signed the year before, but war does not end on paper for families that have already spent their sons. The church orders slowed, the ship bells stopped, bronze was dear, and men came home altered or did not come home at all. My husband Samuel Vale died in France in 1918 while serving with the American Expeditionary Forces. My brother Nathaniel Maren returned from the Meuse-Argonne with 1 lung ruined and a silence no doctor could measure. My son, Thomas, named for the first Maren, died of influenza before he could learn the difference between green sand and loam. After that, people said the shop failed from economics. They were not entirely wrong. They were not entirely right. For more than 30 years I kept the books and the measures because I could not keep the people. I worked small repairs. I tuned dinner bells for farms, cracked school bells for towns too poor to order new ones, handbells for widows who wanted one sound from before the war. I was not admitted into the trade by the men who wrote directories, but metal does not ask whether the hand is permitted, it asks whether the hand is exact. If you mean to pour bell bronze, do not trust memory alone. Use 78 parts copper to 22 parts tin for the truest voice, and keep the melt between 1950 and 2050 degrees Fahrenheit once the tin is taken in. Skim cleanly, but do not starve the metal. Warm the mould slow and dry, steam is treachery. Ram the drag firm at the corners and gentler near the pattern. Give the gases somewhere honest to go. The pour must be continuous once begun, neither timid nor boastful. Let a bell cool in its mould at least 24 hours for small work, and longer for any mouth wider than 2 feet. Never tune a bell before it has stopped arguing with its own birth. Mount it true. Take the first cut lightly and measure the hum, prime, tierce, quint, and nominal before your pride touches the tool. The notebooks hold what my father knew, what I learned, and what loss forced me to hear. They are not commandments. They are a hand extended across a dark room. If you can do better, write it down. If you cannot, do not pretend. There is enough false ringing in the world already. As for the money, I hid it because I had seen banks fail, men lie, heirs quarrel, and useful things sold by those who knew only their weight. Do not spend it quickly. Let it keep the roof, the chimney, the windows, and the tools from weather. Let it buy time before it buys comfort. There is no shame in needing it. There would be shame only in making it small by wanting too little of yourself. Inheritance is not receiving what was polished for you. More often it is finding what was left in dust and deciding not to abandon it again. A house can be empty of furniture and full of instruction. A shop can be stripped of machinery and still contain a discipline. A life can lose husband, son, brother, and name, and still leave behind a measure for someone not yet born. If you have been cast out, do not make exile your only country. If you have been told your hands are wrong for the work, look at the work and ask it directly. If you have no witness, become careful enough that the object itself bears witness. Behind the annex, near the largest walnut, my father drove an iron horseshoe into the trunk after the first successful pour in this building. He said wood grows around what iron remembers. Look there when you need to know whether you're standing in the right place. I leave you tools, measures, and money. But more than those, I leave you permission. That may be the one thing most often stolen from capable hands. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Abigail Maren Vale, April 9th, 1934. Cleo read the last line and did not move. The fire worked softly behind her, taking one piece of wood at a time. Outside, a truck passed over a wet place in the road and sent water against its own undercarriage with a sound like cloth shaken out. In the casting room, the cracked roof admitted a blade of thin sun that crossed the black sand and rested on the rejected mould, making the opened compartment look less like hiding and more like work completed. She read the letter a second time. Not because she had failed to understand it, because the first reading had entered her too quickly, and she needed to let the words take their own order inside the room. On the second reading she noticed the plainness of the grief. No begging, no decoration. No plea to be remembered by anyone important. Only names, dates, losses, temperatures, ratios, and the strange mercy of permission placed where weather could not reach it. When she finished, she laid the pages flat and pressed them gently along their original creases. Paper remembers folding, so do people. She returned each crease to itself, not to close the letter away, but to keep it from tearing by forcing it into a new shape too soon. Then she wrapped it in the cloth again and placed it beside the notebooks. Her hands remained on the bundle for several breaths. After a while, she rose and went out the back door. The yard behind the annex was uneven with old industrial debris half swallowed by soil, brick fragments, rusted strap iron, a wheel rim, burdock stalks from the previous year dry and hollow. Beyond these, the land lowered toward the marsh, but near the safer ground stood the largest walnut tree, ridged and dark, its limbs reaching over the back wall as if it had been listening longer than any person had managed. Cleo approached slowly because the ground was soft. At first she saw only bark, deep furrows, moss in the shaded side, a scar where a limb had fallen long ago. Then about chest height, partly swallowed by decades of growth, she saw the curve of iron, a horseshoe, nearly black, its outer edge visible where the living wood had grown around it. The nails were hidden. The open end pointed upward, cupping rainwater and a few dark grains of last autumn's leaves. She set her palm against the trunk below it. The bark was cold and rough. Under that, life moved too slowly for the hand to feel. Still, the tree had taken iron into itself and continued. It had not healed by erasing the mark. It had grown around it until the mark became part of the way it stood. Cleo leaned her forehead briefly to the bark. No one saw. No one needed to. Near the base of the tree, half covered by leaves, lay a short length of flat stone, perhaps once a step. She cleared it with her boot and sat. From there she could see the foundry's rear wall, the chimney, the damaged roof, the patched sky above it, and the door she had come through. It was still condemned, still stripped, still cold in most rooms. A letter had not repaired a beam or paid a debt at the hardware store. Permission did not nail tar paper to rafters, but it changed the hand that lifted the hammer. She stayed there until the cold of the stone reached through her coat. When she returned inside, the fire had settled low. She fed it carefully and began searching the workbench drawers with a different attention. Not for money now, for continuity. In the third drawer, beneath mouse-chewed paper and a rusted hinge, she found a stub of a beeswax candle wrapped in brown paper. It was no longer than her finger. The wick had yellowed. On the wrapper, in the same narrow hand as the letter someone had written, "First pour candle, not used." Cleo held it near her face. The wax smelled faintly of honey, dust, and thyme, a candle meant for a first pour, saved and never burned. Perhaps Abigail had kept it for a day that did not come. Perhaps she had meant it for someone else. Perhaps its purpose had been waiting, like so much else in the room, not wasted by delay, but sharpened by it. Cleo cleared the office counter and set the candle in a brass fitting she found among the shims. She did not light it for brightness. The afternoon gave enough. She lit it because flame was witness, and because some objects are not used up when burned, they are finally allowed to do what they were made for. The match flared, bent, and caught the wick. For a moment the candle refused, then a small flame stood there, modest and steady, making a circle of light no wider than a bowl. It touched the calipers, the notebooks, the wrapped letter, and the backs of Cleo's hands. The scars shone where the skin was smooth. The candle did not make them softer. It made them visible without accusation. She sat before it until wax began to pool. Into that little light came the people who had helped without asking for ownership of her future. The silver-haired night manager who had left the bruised apple on the loading dock and turned away before gratitude could become difficult. The farmer's wife who had brought the cloudy jar of water to the barn overhang and said nothing, preserving dignity by silence. The thin librarian with the missing cardigan button who had written office hours on a sticky note and warned her gently without closing the door. Mrs. Harrow, who had placed the deed under a brass seal and kept the worn bill separate beneath the cash tray. Nathaniel, who had opened a ruled account and called credit away for work to begin. None of them had saved her in the manner stories often demand. No one had arrived with a carriage, a checkbook, a spare room, or a declaration that all harm was finished. Each had given something narrow enough to fit through the day. An apple, water, information, a key, a manual, a way to owe without being owned. Small kindness has a sound of its own. It does not ring above rooftops, it does not gather crowds in the street. It is more like a tuning fork touched to wood, quiet at first, then present under the hand, long after the first note seems gone. Maybe you have known one. Maybe someone once left food where you could take it without shame, or gave you a ride without asking for the whole story, or spoke your name correctly in a season when you felt nearly erased. If a kindness like that has ever found you, hold it for a moment now, not loudly, just honestly. Some of us are still standing because somebody did one careful thing and never knew how far the sound travelled. Cleo watched the candle lower by a quarter inch. Then she took the notebooks and arranged them by date, earliest first. The tools she wrapped again, each in its own cloth, except the calipers, which she placed beside the letter because the first page had mentioned measures and because some pairings feel correct before reason explains them. The tin she did not open again. She found a temporary hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in the office. One she had already tested and marked in pencil on the underside so she could find it without searching like a thief. Before dusk, she copied 3 lines from the letter onto the back of a scrap envelope. Let it buy time before it buys comfort. Steam is treachery. If you have no witness, become careful enough that the object itself bears witness. She placed the scrap on the wall above the stove where smoke would not reach it. It curled at the edges almost immediately in the warmth. She weighted the lower corners with 2 small nails pressed through existing cracks in the plaster. Not decoration, instruction. That night, she did not sleep in the office. She made her bed in the finishing room near the stove where the floor was sound and the wall still held plaster over lath. She folded her coat under one shoulder, placed the notebooks inside the curve of her arm, and set the wrapped letter against her chest beneath both hands. The calipers lay beside her, wrapped but near enough that their shape showed through cloth. The candle pinched out with a wetted finger before it could burn too low, sat on the counter with its blackened wick, bent slightly forward. Rain began again after midnight. It came first as a tapping on slate, then as a whisper through the roof wound, then as a steady conversation with every surface the building still offered. Cleo woke once and listened. The stove held a red eye under ash. The room smelled of wax, smoke, metal, and old paper. For the first time since the sleet-bright kitchen where the box had waited with her name on it, she did not sleep with her shoes tied. She loosened the laces and left them loose. Beside her, the heirlooms kept their own silence. The first snow came on December 4th, not as a storm with authority, but as a patient whitening that began before dawn and kept at its work until 6 inches lay over the road. The walnut roots, the cemetery wall, and the torn blue tarp that snapped above the Foundry's open roof. Cleo stood in the casting room with her coat buttoned to the throat and watched flakes come through the wound overhead. They drifted down without hurry, landing on black sand on the stripped lathe bed, on the shoulder of the rejected mould, on the brick edge of the furnace bases. Snow inside a building is a kind of verdict. It says the weather has found ownership. It says anything not covered will be asked to endure what it was never made to endure. She did not begin by climbing. She went to the finishing room, built a cautious fire, and read the roofing chapter in the 1974 manual 3 times. The first reading gave her the order of the work. The second gave her the vocabulary. The third gave her the places where a tired person could get hurt. Sister rafter, temporary brace, chalk line, lap, felt course, drip edge, nail pattern. She wrote the words on the back of an envelope and drew a crude rectangle of the damaged roof, then measured the room below with twine knotted at every foot. The open section was larger than it had seemed from the floor, 22 feet along the ridge, 14 feet from ridge to eave where the slate had failed worst. A smaller tear near the chimney added another 6 by 8 feet. The surviving rafters were hand-cut and uneven, not modern lumber, and several had softened where water had travelled year after year along the same path. She calculated slowly, rubbing out figures with her thumb. She would need sheathing patches before any felt could lie flat, tar paper under the winter cover, and shingles only where the temporary repair could become permanent. At Harrow & Sons. Nathaniel listened without interrupting while she recited dimensions from the envelope. "Do not buy shingles for the whole roof," he said. Not yet. You will waste money trying to cover what must first be made honest. He took down prices on his side of the counter. 3 bundles of 3-tab asphalt shingles, $31 each. 1 roll 15-pound felt, $24.50. 5 pounds galvanized roofing nails, $14.80. 2 sheets 1/2-inch exterior plywood, $18 each, discounted because one corner was broken. 4 2x6 boards for sistering rafters, straight enough, $9 each. A small box of 8-penny nails, a chalk line, a used pry bar with the handle taped, a can of roofing cement already dented. The total sat in the notebook like a second weather system. Nathaniel closed the register drawer without pressing sale. "You will need a hatchet," he said. "I can use the hammer. For some things?" He disappeared into the back room and returned with a roofing hatchet. Its head dark, its gauge worn, its handle rubbed nearly black by an older hand. He set it on the counter. "Not among the priced goods. My wife's father carried that for 32 years. He would not want it polished and hung on a wall." Cleo touched the handle. "It felt warmer than the air. I cannot buy it. I did not price it." She looked at him then, and he looked back with the steady impatience of a man who preferred gratitude shown in use. "Keep the blade covered when it is in your bag," he said. "And do not swing tired." The next morning, Nathaniel came to the foundry with a man named Walter Ames. Walter was 78, narrow as a fence post, and dressed in a brown canvas coat patched at both elbows. He had been a roofer before his knees stopped trusting ladders, and he carried himself with the grave annoyance of someone who believed gravity had become more opinionated with age. He wore a black knit cap pulled low and held a thermos in one hand. His face had the colour and texture of a baked apple, lined deeply around the mouth from years of squinting at pitch and glare. "I do not work for pay," Walter said before Cleo could speak. She nodded. "Yes, sir." "I do not climb wet slate." "Yes, sir." "I do not argue with frightened people on ladders." Cleo looked at the roof, then back at him. "I will try not to be frightened loudly." Walter's mouth moved once, almost a smile, then settled. For 11 days, weather allowing, they worked from morning until the light went thin. Walter did not lift what he knew his body should not lift. Cleo did the climbing, the carrying, the crawling along boards set across safer rafters. He taught from below, terse and exact, that rafter's lying. She stopped. Where? Belly. Mid-span. She tested it with her weight and felt the give he had seen from 20 feet away. Do not trust grey wood. They sistered the worst rafters first, setting new 2x6s alongside the weathered originals, fastening them with staggered nails and bolts where the wood still had enough body to hold. Walter made her check each bearing point, not only the break. He showed her how rot travels farther than colour admits. He taught her to cut the end of a brace so it met the old shape rather than forcing the old shape to become square for her convenience. Wood remembers insult, he said. The chalk line came on the 4th day, when the sheathing patches were ready. Walter made her snap it twice on scrap, before allowing it above. The first line wavered because her hand lifted. The second was clean. On the roof, the chalk string left a blue mark across plywood and aged boards, a modest geometry laid over disorder. Nailing became its own lesson. Walter disliked wasted motion. He showed her the 3-stroke nail, the first tap to set, the second to drive, the third to seat without bruising the shingle. That nail's proud. Cleo leaned close. It stood no higher than a match head. Pull it. She pulled it. Again. That one's buried. She cut a replacement shingle. Again. By the 8th day, her shoulders burned each evening as if small stones had been packed under the skin. Her knees carried bruises in pairs. The scars on her hands cracked in the cold, and she rubbed them with stove-warmed oil before sleep. Walter brought nothing soft in his speech, but every morning he arrived with some exact necessity, a board he had found behind his garage, a handful of copper-flashing nails in a baby food jar, a better blade wrapped in newspaper, a thermos cap of coffee pushed toward her without comment. On the 11th day, they set the last winter course near the ridge, while clouds lowered over Troy and the first hard wind came down the road. The repair did not make the roof beautiful. It made it closed. Felt lay under the shingles. Plywood held. The worst opening no longer admitted sky. Near the chimney, a temporary patch leaned into its duty until proper flashing could be done later, under safer weather. Walter stood in the casting room after they climbed down and watched the ceiling for a full minute. No snow came through. He nodded once. Good enough to owe you more work. Then he took his thermos and left before Cleo could answer. By mid-December, the foundry had not become a home, but the weather no longer entered as a rightful owner. When snow fell again on the 16th, it stayed above her. Cleo stood beneath the repaired section and listened to it land on shingles, each small sound separate, softened, held at a distance by work. January came with single-digit mornings and afternoons that rarely climbed above the 20s. And the chimney began to show its injuries in honest detail. Once the roof no longer poured weather straight through the casting room, Cleo could see where water had travelled down the stack for years. Several bricks near the shoulder had spalled, their faces flaked away by freeze and thaw until the soft inner clay showed like exposed flesh. Mortar between courses had powdered in long seams at the clean-out. A corner brick shifted when pressed. Above the stove thimble, a hairline crack ran through 3 joints and disappeared behind plaster. She did not light more than a small fire until she understood the damage. The manual offered only general instruction. Nathaniel supplied the older knowledge. He stood with her behind the counter at Harrow & Sons and drew brick courses on brown wrapping paper. Portland cement is too hard for that stack, he said. It will make the old brick break around it. Use lime where the building used lime. Fire clay near heat. Do not make pride stronger than the wall. He mixed a sample in a coffee can so she could see the body of it. 2 parts screened sand. 1 part hydraulic lime. Near the flue, a smaller batch with fire clay worked in 1 part fire clay to 2 parts lime mortar. Adjusted by feel, not soup, not crumbs. He made her press it with a margin trowel. It should hold a ridge, she pressed. Too wet. He added sand. She pressed again. Closer, for 3 weeks. The chimney set the pace of every day. Cleo worked in layers of clothing, but the cold entered through her boots and settled in her fingers within minutes. She kept 2 cloths near the stove, warming one while wearing the other under her gloves, switching them when her hands began to lose judgment. Bare fingers were necessary for some tasks, especially when cleaning old joints, packing mortar, and feeling whether a brick had seated properly. Every 15 minutes, sometimes sooner, numbness crept from the tips inward. When that happened, she stopped. She put her hands near the stove until feeling returned with its fine, painful needles, then went back. The damaged mortar had to be removed before anything new could be trusted. She used the cold chisel gently, never striking hard near cracked brick. A pointing tool from Nathaniel's used drawer became precious. She raked out joints to sound material, brushed dust away, and misted the brick lightly because dry masonry would steal moisture too quickly from the repair. The first day she worked too long and dreamed that night of sand running from between stacked bones. After that, she kept shorter sessions and better records. January 9th. North face. Lower 6 courses, joints cleared, 3 loose bricks reset. January 11th. Thimble crack cleaned. Stop before dark. Hands unreliable. January 15th. South shoulder spalling. Remove only what comes free. January 18th. Fire clay batch too stiff. Discard. Do not save bad mortar. She learnt the difference between a joint filled and a joint packed. Filled was appearance, packed was duty. Mortar had to be pressed back into the depth, not buttered across the face like apology. She struck the joints with a rounded tool after thumbprint firmness, not before. If she hurried, the surface smeared and told on her. If she waited too long, the mortar resisted and had to be corrected with extra care. The cold made time strange. Mortar cured slowly, water froze in the bucket if left near the door, the pump handle stuck twice, and she wrapped it in burlap after sunset. On days when wind came hard from the river, she worked from inside only, rebuilding the lower stack and sealing the stove connection. On still days, she climbed to inspect the upper brickwork, tied off with rope around the soundest roof beam, moving like someone crossing a sleeping animal she did not wish to wake. Walter came once, stood in the doorway, and watched her work a joint for nearly 10 minutes. "Too smooth," he said. Cleo scratched it out. He nodded and left. By late January, the chimney looked neither new nor false. That pleased her more than newness would have. The repaired joints sat slightly recessed, their colour close but not identical, the way honest mending should be visible to any careful eye. The spalled bricks remained marked but no longer loose. The thimble held, the clean-out door shut without wobble. On January 28th, near dusk, she prepared the test fire. She opened the clean-out first and checked for fallen mortar. Clear, she held a match at the stove mouth and watched the flame lean inward. She lit a twist of paper, then kindling, then one dry piece of wood. Smoke rose, hesitated, and drew cleanly into the flue. Outside, she walked to the rear yard and looked up. A thin blue-grey line lifted from the chimney and travelled east without breaking back into the room. Cleo stood in the snow until her socks began to dampen. The smoke went clean. Inside, the stove warmed with a steadiness it had not known before. Heat moved into the finishing room, touched the patched plaster, the tools, the notebooks stacked in their cloth, and the scrap envelope above the stove. Cleo sat on an upturned crate and held her hands open toward the iron. Soot marked her cheek, lime dust whitened her cuffs. In the stove, wood settled into coal with a sound almost like a bell heard from very far away. The foundry had been waiting, and now Cleo had come. The floors waited until she could no longer avoid hearing them. All through January they had spoken underfoot, not in one voice, but in many. The office floor creaked sharply near the counter, groaned near the door, and gave a dead hollow note beside the missing drawer. The finishing room planks were better, protected by soot, stove heat, and some accident of roofline, but even there the boards wore dark stains where old leaks had travelled. In the casting room, brick and packed sand took most of the weight, but the front room still needed to become safe for walking before spring damp softened what winter had spared. White pine lay under the dirt. Cleo discovered that on a morning when sunlight crossed the office at a low angle and lit one scraped place near the wall, beneath grey grime and blackened oil, the wood held a pale line, fine-grained and close. Some planks were hand-planed. Several were fastened with cut nails whose heads had darkened flush with the surface. Near the oldest threshold she found rose-head nails, hand-cut and irregular, their hammered tops like tiny dark flowers set into the board. Those she would not pull unless the board demanded it. Nathaniel rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, with a deposit he wrote into the account, and did not ask her to produce. He sent 3 sleeves of discs with it, 80, 120, and 220 grit, then added 2 extra 80s from an opened pack. Old floors eat the first grit, he said. She spent the first day not sanding. She set every nail that stood proud using a nail set and light hammer taps. She marked soft boards with chalk. She lifted one plank near the door and found damp black debris beneath, which she cleared with a bent spoon and a brush tied to a stick. Where boards had cupped but remained sound, she left them. A flaw, like a face, does not need to be made young to be made worthy. The sanding began in the office with all doors open and a cloth over her nose. The 80 grit took the top layer slowly, the machine pulling against her wrists like an animal that disliked guidance. She moved with the grain, never dwelling, lifting at the end of each pass. Dust rose despite the bag and settled in her hair, on her lashes, in the folds of her sleeves. The first pass revealed damage without mercy, dark water halos, burns near the stove path, deep scratches where machinery or crates had once been dragged. but it also revealed colour, not bright, not fresh, a dark honey waiting under neglect. The second pass, with 120 grit, quieted the roughness. It softened ridges left by age and old work, leaving enough history to keep the boards themselves. The third pass, 220 grit, she did by hand along edges and near the rosehead nails, unwilling to let the machine erase what a hand had once made. Her back ached. Her knees objected when she rose. Twice she had to stand outside in the cold and cough dust from her throat until her eyes watered. After sanding came cleaning. Sweep, wait, sweep again. Wipe with barely damp cloths. Let dry near the stove heat but not too near. She used a mixture Nathaniel recommended, first a coat of thinned tung oil in the finishing room, worked into the grain with cotton rags, then boiled linseed oil where the older boards seemed to take it better. Thin coats only. No puddles. No haste. 48 hours to cure before the next coat. Longer if the room stayed cold. The first coat made the wood darken as though rain had entered it, and Cleo's breath caught because for one moment she feared she had ruined it. Then the colour settled. Dark honey. By the second coat, the finishing room deepened toward amber. By the third, places near the threshold carried a mahogany glow, not the red of wealth, but the warm brown of something handled, kept, and not yet finished with living. The bad morning came on January 31st. She woke before dawn and knew, before standing, that work would not answer her properly. Her arms felt weighted. Her hands had swollen around the scars, tight from sanding, cold, oil, and too much gripping. The stove needed ash cleared. The floor needed its final rub. The account notebook sat on the counter with numbers that would have to be faced. Outside, sleet ticked at the repaired roof in 1,000 small accusations. She put on her boots and did none of it. Instead, she walked to the marsh with her coat open at the throat because she had forgotten to button it. The ground was frozen at the surface and soft underneath at the water's edge. Reeds stood bent under ice. A great blue heron lifted from the shallows when she approached, its wide wings opening with ancient reluctance. It did not fly far. It crossed to the far bank, folded itself into stillness, and looked away as if granting her the courtesy of not being observed. Cleo sat on a flat stone and watched it for most of the morning. The heron did not hurry. It placed one foot, waited, placed the other, waited longer. Its patience was not gentle. It was survival made elegant by necessity. Once, it struck into the water and came up with nothing. It did not seem insulted. It resumed waiting. Cleo did not work that day. By afternoon, the sleet changed to a fine snow. She returned to the foundry, warmed her hands, ate what was left of yesterday's bread, and rubbed the final coat of oil into the office floor after sunset, not because she had recovered, but because the morning had not taken the whole day with it. The wood accepted the oil in long, uneven breaths under the cloth. The boards gave back a low sheen, enough to catch candlelight, not enough to pretend they had never been damaged. February asked for glass. There were 8 windows across the front and side rooms, though window was a generous word for some of them. 3 had no glass left at all, only boarded openings where wind pressed through gaps and lifted dust from the sill. 4 held cracked panes, starred by stones, temperature, or the slow talk of frames gone out of square. 1 in the eastern wall of the office still held its original wavy glass, thin and imperfect, with small bubbles caught inside like breath from another century. Cleo did not replace that one. Nathaniel came to see it on the first Tuesday of the month, standing in the office with his cap in both hands while winter light bent through the old pane and trembled across the refinished floor. "Leave it," he said. "I planned to." "Good. That glass has seen more than we have." The other windows required labour with a patience different from roofing and masonry. Less strength, more hand. She bought DAP 33 glazing putty, a glazier's point driver Nathaniel found in a drawer, loose points wrapped in wax paper, a narrow putty knife and panes cut to measurement by a man in the back of the hardware store who whistled through his teeth while he worked. Cotton sash cord came from the drawer labelled 1/4 in braided. Nathaniel made her buy enough for all weights, not only the broken ones. "You open a pocket," he said. You do the pair." The first window taught her humility before noon. The sash was painted shut, then swollen, then freed too suddenly so that old paint cracked in long flakes and one remaining pane threatened to fall. She worked the joints with a utility knife, warmed the putty with her hands, and removed glass piece by piece. The rabbets had to be cleaned without gouging wood, made tender by age. Old glazing came away in stubborn chips. Beneath it, the frame smelled of dust, linseed, and weather. DAP 33 was not hurried material. Nathaniel had warned her. Knead it until pliable. Roll a thin bed into the rabbet. Set the glass gently, never pressing at the centre. Points every several inches, firm enough to hold, not so hard the pane complains. Then the face putty, drawn smooth at an angle, clean line from corner to corner. Her first bead looked like a tired snake. She scraped it out and began again. By the third window, her hand learned the pull. She kept the putty knife low, wrist steady, pressure even. Corners remained difficult. Corners tell the truth about a worker. She redid many. The cracked panes came out wrapped in newspaper and tied before disposal, because broken glass in a workroom is a betrayal waiting for a foot. Each new pane altered the room in a way that seemed impossible for something so thin. Wind lessened, light steadied, the stove held warmth longer. Dust stopped moving in certain corners. The sash cords were a separate lesson. Behind the trim, the pockets held iron counterweights black with age, some still tied to cords that had frayed to threads, others lying loose at the bottom of their channels. Cleo opened the first pocket with care, catching the weight before it fell. The cotton cord passed over the pulley down to the weight, and there Nathaniel had insisted on the figure-8 knot. Not a granny knot, he had said. I know a figure-8. Know it with cold fingers. So she practiced at night by stove-light, tying and untying until her hands could do it without instruction. Through the pulley, around, back, dressed clean tail, long enough not to slip. The counterweight rose and fell with a soft scrape when she tested the sash. And the first time a repaired window stayed open on its own, Cleo stood looking at it as if it had performed a small act of trust. By the last week of February, 7 windows had been made serviceable, not perfect. The frames still bore scars. Some panes were new and too clear beside old wood. Some rails sat slightly crooked because the building itself had shifted and would not be bullied back into youth. But the rooms changed under the work. Morning entered in clean shapes. Late light rested on the floorboards and made their oil glow. At night, when the candle burned near the notebooks, the glass reflected one flame as several, each faint, each steady. The final window was the east office pane beneath the original wavy glass. It did not need full replacement, only a lower sash repaired, 2 cracked panes changed, and new cord on one side. Cleo began after breakfast, working slowly because the old pane above it made her cautious. Outside, the walnut branch nearest the wall moved in a mild thaw wind. Snow had retreated from the south side of the trunk, leaving wet leaves pressed to the ground and the iron horseshoe, dark against living bark. She had just drawn the last putty line smooth when a chickadee landed on the walnut branch outside. It was a small thing, round against the cold, with a black cap and quick eyes. It hopped once, twice, then clung upside down to a twig, inspecting the window as if judging the workmanship from its own trade. Cleo held still with the putty knife in her hand. The bird tilted its head. The new glass held both of them, the chickadee outside on the bare branch, Cleo inside among tools, oil, dust, and the winter light crossing a floor she had brought back by inches. The bird gave one clear note. Then it flew. Late February softened the days without making them kind. The snow along the road thinned into grey ridges. Water ran beneath it by afternoon and froze again at night, leaving the Foundry yard crossed with brittle veins of ice. Inside, the rooms had begun to hold heat long enough for Cleo to notice where the walls were failing. Not all damage announced itself when the building was cold. Some appeared only after repair elsewhere had made the neglected parts visible. The plaster near the chimney was the worst. It had been laid over hand-split oak lath, each narrow strip fastened with small nails and separated by gaps where wet plaster had once pushed through and formed keys behind the wall. In 3 patches, those keys had failed. One area bulged above the stovepipe, sounding hollow when tapped. Another had cracked in a spidered oval near the thimble. The third, lower on the wall, had already fallen away, exposing lath darkened by years of heat, soot and damp. Cleo did not tear out what still held. She tested with the handle of the putty knife, tapping outward from each crack until the sound changed from hollow to firm. She marked those lines in pencil. The good plaster was allowed to remain good. The bad was removed carefully into a bucket, not smashed, not stripped in anger. Behind it, the oak lath appeared, rough-faced and split by hand long before plywood, drywall and speed had taught buildings a thinner kind of patience. Nathaniel found the horsehair. It came from the upper shelf of his back room in a paper sack printed with a feed company logo from the 1950s. The sack had been folded twice and tied with string. Inside was clean hair, dark and pale mixed, saved by his father from a plasterer who had retired before Cleo was born. "Still good if it is dry," he said. She lifted a pinch. It was springy and strange between her fingers. The mix was different from chimney mortar, softer in its purpose, meant to hold a wall together while allowing it to breathe. Lime putty screened sand, water and horsehair teased apart so it would bind through the coat instead of clumping like a poor thought. The first coat was scratch, pressed firmly into the lath so it pushed through and gripped behind. She scored it with horizontal lines using a broken comb. Nathaniel had given her for that purpose. Then it had to wait. Waiting became part of plastering. The brown coat went on after the scratch had set enough to take pressure without surrendering. 3/8 of an inch, no more, built proud enough to bring the patch near the original wall. She used a straight edge across the old plaster to judge thickness. Too much and the finish would bulge. Too little and the repair would confess itself from across the room. The brown coat had to cure 72 hours longer in cold, and she wrote the start time on the wall in pencil, because guessing had become one of the few sins she could reliably avoid. During those waiting days, the patches changed colour slowly, wet grey to dull beige, soft to thumbprint firm. The room smelled mineral and faintly animal from the hair, not unpleasant, only ancient. On the 4th day, she laid the finish coat thin, 1/8 of an inch, with a steadier hand than she expected. The trowel whispered over the surface. Lime closed the patch into the wall without hiding its edges entirely. She stepped back when the last section was done. "These patches will hold another 100 years." The sentence came without sound, not as pride, but as measure. She cleaned the trowel, rinsed the bucket before lime could harden, and opened the window a finger's width to let damp air move. The wall near the chimney no longer looked wounded. It looked mended by someone who had understood that a patch should not boast. It should endure. Doris Bell owned the River Cup. The diner Cleo had passed on her first walk out from the county office, though owned was not the word Doris used. "I keep it open," she said. "That is different." She was in her late 60s, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut short and a face made brisk by years of early mornings. Her apron was always clean at 7 and stained by noon. She wrote orders without looking at the pad, carried plates 3 at a time, and had the habit of addressing every person as honey except those who needed sterner language. The first time Cleo entered, intending only to buy coffee with coins from the office desk, Doris looked at her hands, then at the soot near her ear, then poured soup into a bowl instead. "I asked for coffee," Cleo said. "I heard you. I cannot pay for soup." "Then do not insult it by letting it get cold." After that, paper bags began appearing at the Foundry door. Not daily, not in a way that made obligation heavy. Once there would be day-old rolls wrapped in wax paper. Another morning, 2 hard-boiled eggs, salt folded into a twist of napkin, and an apple with a bruise cut away. On a Sunday, a pint jar of stew appeared, still warm enough to fog its lid, with a note taped to the side. "Return jar when convenient." Cleo tried twice to pay. Doris refused both times while wiping the counter with a circular motion that made refusal part of housekeeping. "You can pay me in candles when the shop reopens." "It is not a shop." "Not today." Doris did not ask for the story. That was part of the kindness. She let Cleo sit at the end stool during storms, near the pie case, with the manual open and a pencil in hand. Sometimes she refilled coffee without comment. Sometimes she asked one practical question. Roof still holding? Yes. Ma'am. Good. Then she went back to the grill, where bacon snapped in its own language and the radio played low enough that no song troubled the room. Caleb Rusk arrived in March with a Schwinn bicycle, a splitting maul across the handlebars, and a face still deciding whether to be a boy's or a man's. He was 16, narrow-wristed, red-haired, and solemn in the exaggerated way of teenagers carrying instructions from home. His jeans were too short, his boots too large, and his jacket had a school patch sewn on one sleeve. Cleo was stacking broken mouldboards near the rear wall when he rolled the bicycle through the gate and leaned it against the walnut tree. My mother said you need wood split. Cleo looked at them all. Who is your mother? Mrs. Rusk. At the library, the librarian with the missing cardigan button had been Mr. Rusk. Then, and this was his son or nephew. Cleo did not correct the chain of kindness. She pointed to the dry pile under the tarp. I can split it, my mother said. He shifted his weight. About your grandfather. He was my great-uncle. Caleb nodded, as if the distinction had already been covered at home and he had failed to remember the proper term. She said he fixed a school bell once and did not charge, because the class had already raised money with a bake sale, and he would not take children's cake money. That sounded like Silas. It made the morning alter its shape around her. Caleb split wood badly at first. He lifted the maul too much with his arms and not enough with his whole body. Cleo corrected him because allowing poor work was another kind of disrespect. Feet wider, he adjusted. Do not fight the knot. He frowned at the round before him, as if it had become personal. By noon he had learned to read checks in the wood and turn each piece for the better line. He would not accept money. He would not accept coffee. He accepted, after visible debate, one roll from a Doris bag and ate it standing with the gravity of a young man doing a job that had been entrusted to him. He came back every Saturday for 5 weeks, always by bicycle, always with the maul, sometimes with library discards for Cleo's stove, sometimes with a question about tools. On the 4th visit, he stood beside the lathe and ran one finger along the rusted bed. Will that ever work? Not soon. But maybe. Cleo wiped oil into a cleaned section of iron. Maybe is a large word if you do not spend it too quickly. Caleb considered that, then went outside and split more wood than the stove could use in 3 days. Reverend Boyd did not enter the Foundry until April, and even then only as far as the threshold. He walked past every morning at nearly the same hour, a tall black man in a long wool coat and polished shoes, carrying a leather Bible under one arm. His church stood beyond the cemetery wall, a modest brick building with a white steeple and a bell that wavered at the edge of its note. He had a trimmed grey beard, thoughtful eyes, and the kind of uprightness that made haste seem unnecessary. Each morning he tipped his hat toward the Foundry gate. The first week, Cleo returned the nod from a distance. The second, he paused and said, "Morning." Morning. The third, he stopped by the walnut tree, looked at the mended roof, the cleared yard, the smoke rising clean from the chimney, and the boards stacked by size along the wall. Work is prayer, he said. 4 words. He did not ask whether she was religious. He did not make the building into a lesson she had not requested. He simply passed, morning after morning, tipping his hat, sometimes adding a weather report, sometimes leaving nothing behind but the measured sound of his shoes on the road. On the first warm day of April, Cleo found a bundle of kindling beside the gate, tied with twine and dry enough to catch from one match. No note. She knew the supporting lives around the Foundry did not crowd her. That was why she could accept them. Doris with her paper bags, Caleb with his Schwinn and solemn maul, Reverend Boyd with 4 words and a tipped hat. None tried to make her grateful in public. None asked to be named in the story, while the story was still deciding whether it could stand. The seller waited until February 11th, because everything beneath a building asks for courage of a different sort. Roof work could be seen from the road, windows admitted light, floors improved under the hand. The cellar, by contrast, held its condition in the dark and gave no report except damp rising through boards near the rear wall. Cleo had found the door weeks earlier beneath a layer of dust and 2 broken pattern boards. It was a low plank hatch behind the finishing room, fitted with an iron ring and swollen tight in its frame. She had marked it, swept around it, and postponed it with reasons that were mostly good and partly fear. On the morning of the 11th, the ground outside was frozen hard enough to make the pump handle sting. She built a fire, ate bread from Doris with a little salt, and carried the lantern to the hatch. It took the pry bar, 2 wedges, and more patience than strength to open. The wood lifted with a long complaint. Cold air came up, dense and mineral, not foul. That mattered. She waited, letting the cellar breathe into the room before lowering the lantern. Stone steps appeared, descending steeply into darkness. 7 steps. Granite, worn at the centre by feet long gone. She tested each with the broom handle before trusting it. The walls were fieldstone, laid with lime mortar, damp but standing. At the bottom, the cellar measured about 12 by 15 feet, with a floor of packed earth and flat stones set into the centre path. Spider webs hung from joists in grey curtains. A shelf along the north wall had collapsed under jars that now held only dust and clouded glass. In one corner lay a broken barrel hoop, in another a heap of coal gone dull and powdery at the edges. At the centre of the floor sat a single dressed granite slab. It did not belong to the rougher stones around it. Its top had been worked smooth, and on that surface someone had carved the same craft mark found on the mould and tools, a simple bell form, circle, line, 2 arcs. The slab was rectangular, perhaps 3 feet by 2, fitted tightly into the floor. Cleo knelt and brushed dirt from the mark. She did not lift it. Everything in her training told her not to disturb a thing only because it invited curiosity. The cellar was cold, she was alone, the slab was heavy and possibly structural, possibly covering a drain, possibly marking something meant to be opened only with knowledge she did not yet have. She set her palm on it once, feeling the stone's winter against her skin, then stood. "Not today," she said aloud. Her voice sounded small and correct in the cellar. She inspected the walls, checked for water lines, looked up at the joists and found no immediate failure. On the way back up, with the lantern held low, she noticed the 3rd step from the top had a shadow beneath its front edge. Not the deep shadow of the stair itself, a wedged shape. She set the lantern on the 2nd step and reached carefully. Her fingers touched wood. A small oak box had been pressed beneath the tread, held in place by a rusted nail and the swelling of time. It came free only after she worked it side to side for several minutes. The box was no longer than her hand, darkened almost black, with a sliding lid stuck by dust. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because cellars are poor places to meet small revelations. On the workbench, the lid loosened under the edge of a knife. Inside lay a brass key and a tin-type photograph wrapped in tissue. The key was unlike the plain ring key from the county file. Its bow had been shaped like the craft mark, not crudely, but by a hand that understood both utility and symbol. The shaft was narrow, the bit cut with 3 careful teeth. It had not turned anything in years. Cleo held it to the light and saw green in the grooves, dust near the bow, and a faint shine where the tissue had protected it. The photograph was small, dark, and clear enough to make the room recede. A young woman stood in front of the Foundry, the same front wall, though newer, the same arched openings unboarded, the sign above the door fresh and legible. The young woman wore a long dark skirt, a white blouse with sleeves rolled to the forearms, and an apron marked by work. In one hand she held a wooden rammer used for packing sand. Her other hand rested on a flask set upright beside her. She was 25, perhaps, with steady eyes, a direct mouth and a face that made Cleo's hands go cold. not identical. No living person repeats another perfectly. But the line of the jaw, the set of the brow, the compact hands, the way she faced the camera without asking permission from it. Cleo saw herself there with time standing between them like glass. She turned the photograph over. In faded ink, the back read, Abigail Maren, daughter of Jonathan Maren, age 25, summer of 1903. Cleo set the photograph down gently and looked toward the front office, where the windows now held light more steadily than before. The woman in the tintype had stood outside those walls when the sign was new, when the roof held, when the floor rang with work, when no one yet knew how much would be lost or hidden. She had held a tool of the trade openly, her sleeves rolled, her face unashamed. The brass key went on the mantel above the stove. At first Cleo meant to hide it with the money, then she did not. Some unknowns should remain visible, not as temptation, but as discipline. The key lay beside the candle stub, the calipers, and the scrap of copied lines from the letter. Every day afterward she saw it. Every day she did not know what it opened. That ignorance became part of the room's order. A small bright question waiting without haste. By March, the snow retreated from the foundry in uneven truces. It lingered along the north wall and under the shadow of the storage yard fence, then vanished in one rainy afternoon, leaving the ground flattened, littered, and newly honest. The creek beyond the marsh grew loud with snowmelt. It carried sticks, seed husks, torn leaves, and the cold shine of upland water. At night, frogs called from the low ground with growing confidence. The walnut trees put out catkins, small and greenish, hanging like quiet tassels from branches that had seemed dead all winter. The foundry changed in response to light. Morning reached farther through the repaired windows. The casting room no longer smelled first of damp, but of sand, brick, old metal, and the faint sweetness of wood warming after cold months. Cleo opened doors during the day to move air through the building. She swept winter grit from the threshold, she washed the office counter, she sorted mould boards by usefulness, stacked broken brick by size, and cleaned one corner of the casting floor until the black sand lay level under the rake. People began to pass more slowly on the road, not stopping, mostly looking. The dog at the fence barked less and wagged once, as though he had reached his own conclusion about the matter. Reverend Boyd tipped his hat. Caleb came with wood until the pile no longer required rescue. Doris sent fewer paper bags once Cleo began earning small repair money sharpening mower blades and cleaning 2 brass lamps for a woman who heard about her through the diner. The notebooks remained unopened some days, not from neglect but from respect. Cleo had begun to understand that she could not rush toward the furnace simply because bronze waited. Bell metal demands more than desire. It demands proper crucibles, dry molds, safe lifting gear, venting, a controlled melt, and help at the pour. She would not begin the craft that spring. She wrote that decision on paper and placed it in the first notebook. Not yet is not refusal. She ordered small materials with 1 coin and only one. A worn $50 sold carefully through Nathaniel's cousin, who dealt in old coins and paid fair because Nathaniel stood beside the counter when the exchange was made. With that money, she bought new sand, a little bentonite clay, parting dust, 2 small crucible samples for future testing, and beeswax. She made practice molds no larger than her palm. She rammed sand around simple patterns, lifted them, cut gates, spoiled them, and began again. No melt, no pour, only preparation. In April, she planted nothing and repaired much. The roof patch held through hard rain. The chimney drew clean. The floors no longer spoke of danger at every step. Windows opened, held, closed. The plaster cured. The cellar stayed dry enough to wait. On warm afternoons, she sat on the threshold with the notebooks open and copied frequency tables until numbers began to show their relationships. Hum, prime, tierce, quint, nominal voices around a table. Once, near the end of April, the chickadee returned to the walnut branch outside the office window. Cleo looked up from the notebook and watched it hop along a twig newly tipped with green. Behind her, the brass key rested on the mantel, still unused. Before her, the foundry's repaired rooms held a kind of ordinary silence that had taken months to earn. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, In December 2024, Cleo poured her first completed bell before sunrise on a morning so cold the marsh reeds wore a brittle silver rim. It was not large, the mouth measured only 7 inches across, and the whole bell could be lifted in 2 hands once cooled and cleaned. She had spent months preparing for it, not in the dramatic manner people imagine when they think of old crafts returning, but through trial pieces, failed moulds, cracked samples, uneven tones, and notebooks filled with corrections written in pencil. She had built the flask herself from seasoned maple. She had rammed the sand slowly, cut the gates clean, dried the mould beyond doubt, and checked every tool the night before. The bronze came from new stock, not from the hidden ingots. Those she kept for study, reluctant to spend inherited metal on her first uncertain voice. Nathaniel stood at a safe distance, older now by 2 winters, but unwilling to miss the pour. Caleb, taller and quieter, helped with lifting under instruction and said almost nothing because Cleo had told him beforehand that silence was part of the work. Reverend Boyd stood beyond the threshold with his hat in his hands. Doris had sent coffee in a thermos and biscuits wrapped in 2 towels. The melt took longer than Cleo expected, as important things often do. She watched colour, she watched the pyrometer, she watched the surface skin and the way the metal moved beneath it. When it reached the proper heat, and the last hesitation had no honest reason left, she nodded to Caleb. Together they lifted, turned, and poured in one steady stream. The bronze entered the mould without splash, without boast, without breaking its own line. A brief glow rose from the sprue, then settled. No one spoke. The bell cooled in its mould the full time, and longer, because winter offered no forgiveness for impatience. When Cleo finally broke the sand away, the casting emerged dark, rough, and plain. Flash along the seam, a small fin near the lip, surface marks where the sand had told on her. She cleaned it, mounted it, and took cautious cuts on the lathe she had restored over 2 years with salvaged parts, new bearings, and patient alignment. The first strike was dull, the second, after careful tuning, opened. Not perfect. True enough to continue. The interior of the Foundry by then did not look rescued in the decorative sense. It looked worked in. The office held a scrubbed counter. The repaired desk, 2 chairs with new cane seats woven by a woman from the church, and shelves made from boards saved during roof repair. The original wavy glass window bent morning light over the floorboards, which had darkened further into a deep brown glow from oil use and stove warmth. The finishing room held the iron stove, the notebooks in a locking cabinet Nathaniel had helped fit, and the mantel where the brass key, the candle stub, and the calipers remained in their places. The casting room had changed most slowly. Black sand no longer lay in drifts of neglect. It was stored, sifted, labelled, and used in practice. The rejected mould still stood in the rear corner, opened compartment empty now except for cedar scent and darkness. The lathe, once stripped and ashamed, turned with a low belt sound after Cleo installed a rebuilt motor bought from a machinist retiring in Mechanicville. The roof did not leak above it. The chimney drew. Workbenches held tools in order. Nothing was extravagant. Nothing was wasted. The brass key stayed on the mantel until the day the walnut tree gave its answer. It happened in the same winter, after the first bell had cooled and been tuned on a mild afternoon between storms. Caleb had been helping clear brush near the rear wall when he called Cleo outside, not loudly, but with enough edge in his voice to bring her from the bench. He stood by the largest walnut, one hand on the trunk below the iron horseshoe. A piece of bark had fallen away during a thaw, exposing something beneath the horseshoe's right curve. Not a hollow. A plate. Brass, dark green at the edges, nearly grown over by wood. It had been fitted long ago into a narrow recess in the trunk, perhaps when the tree was younger, perhaps before anyone could imagine how the living bark would close around it. At the centre of the plate was a keyhole so small and dark it might have been only damage until Cleo brushed it clean with a soft wire tool. Caleb looked toward the Foundry. The mantel key. Cleo did not answer immediately. She went inside, took the key from its place, and returned with a cloth wrapped around it. Though no one had asked, the bow shaped like the craft mark rested against her palm. For 2 years she had not known what it opened. The ignorance had become almost companionable. Now the question had come due. The key entered with resistance, then seated. She turned it slowly. Something inside the trunk released with a small, wooden click. A narrow compartment opened inward, not deep, lined with tin blackened by age, and sealed against damp better than any box had a right to be. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag wrapped in oilcloth and a paper packet tied with blue thread. The flag was small, not a full burial flag, perhaps a service flag kept in a home, its stars arranged in rows from a country that had not yet counted all it would become. The cloth smelled faintly of cedar, metal, and enclosed years. The note was dated November 11th, 1919. Cleo unfolded it beneath the walnut tree because the date asked to be read in air. The hand was Abigail's, younger than the letter in the mould, firmer, darker in ink. Samuel's flag has no mantle now, and Nathaniel cannot bear the sight of it folded in the room where Thomas's cradle stood. Father says the walnut will hold what the house cannot. If any one of ours finds this, know that he was kind before he was brave, and brave before anyone called him so. Do not let the war have his whole name. There was no more. Cleo refolded the note along its old lines. Caleb removed his cap without being told. The walnut branches moved lightly above them, bare against a pale sky. The iron horseshoe, driven there after the first successful pour, curved above the hidden plate like a hand that had been sheltering memory for more than a century. They did not take the flag inside at once. Cleo stood with it beneath the tree and looked toward the foundry, toward the roof, chimney, windows, walls, floors, and rooms that had become able to receive such things. A building can be unready for memory. It can also be made ready by work. On November 11th of the following year, Cleo carried the military medal and the folded note to Oakwood Cemetery in Troy. The date was Armistice Day, though many called it Veterans' Day now, and the morning held a clean cold that made every sound distinct. Reverend Boyd walked with her as far as the gate, and then left her to continue alone. She had found Samuel Vale's marker after weeks of searching records, guided by Mrs. Harrow's patient help and an index written in a hand nearly as tight as Abigail's. The stone was modest, weathered, and partly shaded by oak limbs. Cleo brushed lichen from the lower edge with a soft cloth. She did not leave the medal there. Weather would take it, theft might. Instead, she held it in both hands, read the name on the back aloud once, and placed it for 1 minute on the stone while the cemetery wind moved through dry leaves. Then she wrapped it again and took it home. Honouring did not require abandonment. Some things are carried back. The money remained mostly where it had been placed after she made a safer compartment behind the office wall. She spent only what the letter had permitted by need and measure, 3 coins first, then a 4th when the lathe motor became possible, then a 5th for the first order of proper bell bronze after her trial pause proved she could proceed without vanity. Each coin was recorded in a ledger beside its purpose, buyer, date, and the repair it made possible. The bills stayed wrapped, the remaining coins stayed in rolls, the bank book stayed with the papers, not as usable wealth, but as evidence of a life that had distrusted easy custody for good reason. People told her, when they learned only fragments, that she should put the money in a bank, invest it, make it grow, use it for comfort, buy a better bed, a truck, a proper sign, a furnace new enough to impress visitors. She listened politely. Then she returned to the office and wrote on a clean sheet of paper, for the next one. She placed that paper inside the tin, on top of the remaining envelopes. The phrase did not mean she expected a daughter, or an apprentice, or anyone particular. It meant that inheritance had already travelled farther than prediction. It meant the cachet was not a prize for escape, but ballast for continuity. Roofs fail again, chimneys crack again. Good tools pass to careless hands if no one writes down why they matter. She had been found by a hidden provision. She would not be the generation that used it up because hunger had taught her fear of emptiness. The shop reopened so quietly that, for several weeks, only the River Cup knew Doris put an index card on the corkboard between a notice for piano lessons and a handwritten offer of snow shoveling. The card was cream-coloured, written in Cleo's careful hand. Hand bell repair, small bronze work, tuning by appointment, Maren Vale Annex. No phone number at first, only general delivery, and the diner's permission to receive messages, though. Doris complained that Cleo's customers wrote smaller than church ladies and worse than doctors. The first job was a cracked school handbell from Brunswick. The second was a farm dinner bell whose yoke had indeed lied to it. The third was not a bell at all, but a bronze door pull from an old house, worn thin by generations of hands and nearly thrown away during a renovation. Cleo worked slowly and charged plainly. By the second winter, the mailing list had 43 names written in a ledger Doris insisted on buying because order, she said, was not the enemy of mystery. Some people wanted repairs, some wanted to know when a small batch of bells might be available. Some wrote because their grandmothers had owned bells from Troy, and they wanted to tell someone who would understand the difference between possession and keeping. There was no grand opening, no ribbon, no article at first. No crowd pressing into the road to celebrate a young woman who had survived what they had not seen. The reopened shop announced itself by the ordinary means of useful work. A bell returned to a school, a farm wife hearing supper called again after 20 years, a church custodian carrying in a cracked clapper wrapped in a towel, a boy on a bicycle, now nearly a man, sweeping the floor without being asked. Caleb returned with the sign in April. He had grown taller than the splitting mall and had begun to move with the slightly astonished self-consciousness of someone discovering his own strength. He arrived near dusk, pushing the Schwinn one-handed because the other arm held a longboard wrapped in an old sheet. Cleo was cleaning the latheways when she heard the familiar rattle of the bicycle near the gate. "My mother said not to make a speech," he said. "Then do not." I was not going to. He unwrapped the board on the office counter. It was a hand-carved sign, made from walnut. The letters cut deep and darkened with careful stain. Not polished smooth into lifelessness. The grain remained visible. The tool marks faint but honest. At first, Cleo saw only the familiar name. Maren Vale. Then Caleb turned the board fully toward her. Maren Vale, Bell Metal Works, daughters. The last two words were smaller, but not timid. Plural, carved with the same depth as the rest. Cleo looked at the sign long enough that Caleb began to shift his weight. "If you hate it, I can plane it down." "No, it was my idea, but Dad helped with the spacing." "No," she said again, softer. "Do not plane it." He nodded, trying not to look relieved. They hung it 2 days later beneath the old weathered sign rather than replacing it. Cleo would not take down what had survived. The new board hung below the old one, walnut under faded paint, present under memory. Reverend Boyd happened to pass while they were setting the last screw and stopped at the road with his hat in his hand. Doris came after closing, wiping her hands on her apron though there was no counter near. Nathaniel stood back and judged the level with one eye. Mrs. Harrow arrived last, carrying a folder she did not open, and looked at the sign for a long while. "Plural," she said. Caleb straightened. "Yes." "Ma'am." "Mrs." Harrow nodded once. "About time." No one clapped. That would have been the wrong sound. The sign moved slightly in the spring air, and the old chain above it creaked. In the road, the dog with the white muzzle barked twice, perhaps at them, perhaps at nothing, then lay down again with his chin on his paws. That evening, after everyone left, Cleo sat at the office desk and began her own letter. She had bought good paper for it, thick enough to bear time without pretending to defeat it. The fountain pen had been Nathaniel's father's, repaired by Cleo in exchange for a box of sash weights. She cleaned the nib, set the ink bottle to the right of the page, and waited until the room settled. Outside, rain began on the new roof, a sound she still never heard without gratitude moving through her hands. She wrote the first line slowly. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped, The words did not belong to her originally, but inheritance is not imitation when it is entered honestly. She would not finish the letter that night, perhaps not that year. It had to contain what she had learned and what she still did not know. It had to name the people who had kept the chain from breaking, the clerk with the brass stamp, the hardware man with the account book, the diner woman who accepted payment in a future that did not yet exist, the boy who carved daughters into walnut, the reverend who believed work could pray without speaking loudly. She wrote only 3 more lines. If this has reached you, then something has lasted. Do not hurry to deserve it. Begin by listening. She let the ink dry uncovered. Then she folded nothing. Not yet. The page stayed on the desk overnight, held at the corners by the calipers and the brass key. In the morning she added the date and placed it in a folder marked Next Letter. The folder went into the cabinet with the notebooks, not hidden, not displayed, waiting for the slow accumulation of truth. By then, the first completed bell hung near the office door. Its sound was still modest. Cleo did not pretend otherwise. When struck lightly with a wooden mallet, it opened with a clean note, held for a breath, and then faded with a faint lower shimmer that she had not entirely planned, but had chosen not to remove. Some makers might have chased it away. She left it. The bell knew something about surviving the cut without becoming empty. On the last evening of that second winter, snow began again. Not hard. Not enough to burden the roof, just a slow fall over Troy, over Rensselaer County, over the cemetery wall, the storage yard, the walnut branches, and the marsh where dark water held narrow seams of reflected sky. Cleo stood outside beneath the signs, the aged one above and the new one below, and watched the flakes pass through the beam of light from the office window. The Foundry waited. It had always waited. Inside, the stove held a low fire. The tools were in their places. The notebooks rested behind glass. The letter begun for the next inheritor lay flat in its folder. The remaining money stayed sealed for hands not yet known. The flag, after being aired and examined with care, rested in an archival box Nathaniel ordered from Albany. The medal lay beside it, wrapped in cotton, not buried in a drawer, and not offered to weather. Cleo entered the office and closed the door against the cold. Before banking the stove for the night, she opened the desk drawer where Mrs. Harrow's copied receipt had been kept since the first day. In the same drawer lay a note the clerk had sent months earlier, written in her exact hand. It said that the original worn bill had never been deposited. She had bought it from the county cash tray with one of her own and kept it in the lower right drawer of her desk, beneath a paperweight shaped like a pear. Cleo had read the note many times. She read it once more that night, then placed it back with the receipt. Somewhere downtown, in a county office full of files, maps, stamps, and waiting chairs, the bill that had purchased a condemned ruin still lay folded in a clerk's desk drawer, not as money exactly, but as witness. The stove clicked softly. The bell by the door held its silence. The Foundry had been waiting, and now Cleo had come,